The copper-tasting dust of Georgia's Red Hill was still gritting between Evelyn Thorne's molars at 0415 on a Tuesday, when Drill Sergeant Vance kicked her wall locker open. Spilling 34 white undershirts across the floor, she had spent the previous 4 hours scrubbing on her hands and knees. The sound was a violent metallic crash that echoed through the barracks of 2nd Squad, a sound that Thorne didn't flinch at, though the candidate to her left, a former high school track star named Miller, visibly jumped. Vance didn't look at Miller. He looked at Thorne. He looked at her with the kind of practiced, predatory boredom that defines the men who are paid to find the hairline fractures in a human soul. He was a tall man, built like a stack of cinder blocks, his skin the color of old mahogany and his eyes always hidden behind the silvered lenses of his aviators, even in the pre-dawn gloom of the squad bay. He leaned in so close Thorne could smell the bitter, stale residue of black coffee and the peppermint gum he chewed to stay awake. She didn't blink. She didn't look at the ruin of her locker. She kept her eyes fixed on a point exactly 6 inches above his head, the way she had been taught during the first week of officer candidate school at Fort Moore. She was 27 years old, a woman from Steubenville, Ohio, who had spent her youth pulling transmissions out of rusted-out Chevys in her father's garage, and she knew exactly what it felt like to be under a heavy weight that was looking for a reason to crush you. Vance's voice was a low, gravelly rasp, almost a whisper, which was always more dangerous than the shouting. He told her she was a disgrace to the uniform. He told her that her attention to detail was a lie, a performance meant to hide the fact that she was weak. He took his boot, a polished black weapon of a shoe, and ground one of the pristine white shirts into the damp floor. Thorne watched the fabric turn the color of Georgia clay, the fibers absorbing the filth she had worked so hard to remove. She felt the heat rising in her neck, that familiar, stinging prickle of adrenaline, but she bottled it. She pushed it down into the same place. She kept the memories of the winters in Ohio where the heating went out, and the only way to stay warm was to keep working on the engines. She was emotionally controlled, a trait her father had called the Thorne silence, and it was the very thing that Vance seemed to hate most about her. He wanted a reaction. He wanted her to cry or to snap or to beg for the chance to fix it. Instead, she stood there like a statue carved from the red earth itself, her breathing shallow and rhythmic, her hands at her sides, thumbs aligned with the seams of her trousers. She had come to the army because the garage in Steubenville had finally gone under, and because the silence of a dying town had become louder than she could bear. She hadn't joined for the glory or the GI Bill. She had joined because she was good at understanding how things worked. In the garage, she could hear a misfire in a cylinder before the computer diagnostics even registered a fault. She could feel the vibration of a failing ball joint through the steering wheel of a truck just by placing her palm on the hood. She saw patterns where other people saw chaos. In the military, this was supposed to be an asset, but in the pressurized environment of OCS, it was a liability. She saw the way the instructors moved, the way they chose their targets based on the subtle shifts in posture or the way a candidate's eyes tracked a threat. She knew Vance was targeting her because she was the only one who hadn't broken yet. She was the one who didn't complain during the 12-mile rucks with 60 pounds on her back, the one who didn't fumble her weapon during the high-stress drills on the range. To Vance, she was a puzzle he couldn't solve, and in his world, an unsolved puzzle was a threat. The barracks smelled of floor wax, damp wool, and the peculiar, sharp scent of 32 terrified adults living in close quarters. It was a sensory overload that would have broken most people, but Thorne filtered it. She focused on the sound of the wind rattling the window panes and the distant, rhythmic thud of a helicopter landing at Lawson Army Airfield. She noticed the way the light from the hallway caught the slight tremor in candidate Miller's hands. Miller was going to wash out. Thorne knew it with the same certainty she knew when a belt was about to snap. Miller's pattern was erratic. Her movements were too fast, her speech too high-pitched. She was trying too hard to be what she thought they wanted, whereas Thorne was simply being what she was. Vance stepped back, his shadow stretching long across the linoleum. He didn't tell her to clean it up. He told the entire squad to drop and give him 50 for Thorne's failure. As the room erupted into the synchronized grunt of 30 bodies hitting the floor, Thorne went down with them. She felt the cold floor against her palms, the burn in her triceps, the rhythmic count of the squad. She did the push-ups with a mechanical precision that was almost insulting. Every repetition was a statement. She wasn't doing them because she was being punished. She was doing them because she was a soldier, and this was what soldiers did. The controlled rage stayed tucked away, a cold coal in her chest that she used for fuel. She didn't look at the others. She didn't look at the sergeant. She looked at the floor, noting the exact spot where the wax was beginning to peel near the baseboard. The environment at Fort Moore was a grind of humidity and hierarchy. The candidates were a mix of Ivy League graduates with something to prove, former enlisted soldiers looking for a commission, and kids like Thorne who just wanted a job that mattered. The social architecture was brutal. There were the high-speed types who spent every waking second talking about leadership and tactics, and then there were the ghosts who just tried to survive. Thorne was neither. She was a presence that people didn't know how to categorize. The other women in the company respected her but stayed at a distance, intimidated by her silence. The men mostly ignored her, or they made the mistake of assuming her quietness was a sign of being overwhelmed. Only Miller, the girl from Oregon who smelled like expensive shampoo and desperation, seemed to see past the mask. Late at night when the lights were out and the only sound was the heavy breathing of the exhausted, Miller would whisper across the gap between their bunks, asking Thorne how she did it, how she stayed so still. Thorne never had an answer that Miller could use. You don't teach someone how to be comfortable in the dark. You either are or you aren't. By 0900 that morning, the company was out in the Pine Barrens, a stretch of woods that felt like it had been designed specifically to swallow human ambition. The air was a thick, wet blanket that smelled of decaying pine needles and hydraulic fluid. They were practicing tactical movements, moving in staggered columns through the brush, their rifles, empty but heavy, cradled in their arms. Thorne was the squad leader for the morning, a position she had been given not as a reward, but because the instructors wanted to see her fail under the pressure of command. She moved with a low, predatory grace, her eyes constantly scanning the tree line. This was where her hidden capability began to leak through the cracks of her military bearing. She wasn't just looking for the instructors who were hiding in the brush to simulate an ambush. She was reading the woods. She noticed the way a group of birds had gone silent 500 yards to the north. She saw the way the tall grass had been matted down in a pattern that didn't match the wind. She heard the metallic snick of a radio being keyed long before any of the other candidates noticed a thing. She raised her hand, signaling the squad to halt. Behind her, she could hear the frustrated huffing of Candidate Jackson, a former college quarterback who thought Thorne was moving too slowly. "What are we doing, Thorne?" Jackson whispered, his voice sharp with irritation. "The objective is another half-mile out. We're burning daylight." "Quiet," Thorne said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command that carried the weight of a physical blow. She knelt in the dirt, her fingers brushing the earth. She wasn't looking for tracks. She was looking at the way the shadows were falling. Something was wrong. The training exercise was supposed to be a standard movement to contact, but the enemy wasn't where they were supposed to be. They were flanking. She could feel the shift in the air, the subtle change in the system of the woods. She signaled for her team to pivot 30 degrees to the west, away from the designated path. "The route is the trail, Thorne," Jackson hissed, stepping up beside her. "Vance is gonna smoke us if we go off script." "The trail is a kill zone," Thorne said, her voice flat and certain. "Follow me or don't, but if you walk onto that ridge, you're dead." She didn't wait for his approval. She moved, staying low, utilizing the natural folds of the terrain that the others didn't even see. She led them through a creek bed that was ankle-deep in freezing water, the mud sucking at their boots with a wet, rhythmic sound. 10 minutes later, a series of blank rounds erupted from the ridge they had just bypassed. If they had stayed on the trail, they would have been caught in a perfect L-shaped ambush. Instead, they were now positioned on the enemy's flank. Thorne didn't smile. She didn't look back at Jackson to see the shock on his face. She simply signaled for the squad to prepare for the counter-assault. When the exercise was over, the instructors emerged from the brush looking perplexed. Drill Sergeant Vance was among them, his face a mask of inscrutable bronze. He walked over to Thorne, who was standing at attention, her boots caked in mud, her face streaked with camouflage paint and sweat. He didn't congratulate her. He didn't acknowledge that she had saved the squad from a simulated slaughter. He looked at the mud on her uniform and the way her cover was slightly askew. "You left the path, Candidate Thorne," Vance said, his voice quiet. "The path was compromised, Drill Sergeant," she replied. "I didn't give you permission to decide what is and isn't compromised. I gave you an order to follow a route. You chose to deviate. You chose to think you knew better than the mission parameters." The mission was to reach the objective without being neutralized. Drill Sergeant, I prioritized the survival of the unit. Vance stepped into her personal space, his chest nearly touching hers. You prioritized your own ego. You wanted to show off. You wanted to be the smart girl in the room. In the real world, Thorne, the smart girls are the ones who get their people killed because they think they're too good for the plan. You're not a leader. You're a liability. He turned to the rest of the squad. Because Candidate Thorne thinks the rules don't apply to her, you will all ruck an extra 5 miles back to the barracks. Thorne, you'll carry the squad's spare water cans, all 4 of them. The water cans were 5-gallon plastic jugs, heavy and awkward. Carrying 4 of them meant 2 in each hand, or 2 strapped to her ruck and 2 in her hands. It was an agonizing, bone-deep weight that would turn the 5-mile trek into a nightmare of strained tendons and raw skin. Jackson glared at her as he shouldered his pack. Miller looked away, her eyes wet with pity. Thorne said nothing. She walked to the utility vehicle where the cans were kept, gripped the handles, and felt the weight settle into her shoulders. She didn't look at Vance. She didn't look at the sky. She just started walking. The walk back was a blur of pain and rhythm. The weight of the water cans pulled at her joints, making every step an exercise in willpower. The straps of her ruck bit into the places where her skin was already chafed. The Georgia sun was higher now, beating down through the pines, turning the woods into a humid kiln. She focused on the sound of her own breathing and the crunch of gravel under her boots. She used her capability to map the path ahead, choosing the firmest ground, calculating the exact amount of energy she needed for each uphill grade. She was a machine. She was a system of levers and pulleys, of oxygen and ATP. She didn't allow herself the luxury of anger. Anger was a leak in the system. When they finally reached the barracks, her hands were so cramped they had locked into the shape of the handles. Her fingernails were purple, and her shoulders felt like they had been dismantled and put back together incorrectly. Vance was waiting on the steps, a clipboard in his hand. He watched her as she set the cans down, his eyes unreadable behind the aviators. "Go to the back of the line, Thorne," he said. "You're late for the midday inspection." The dismissal was quiet, institutional, and complete. There was no recognition of the feat she had just performed, no acknowledgement of the grit it took to carry nearly 200 pounds of water over 5 miles of broken terrain. She was just a body in a line, a name on a list that he was waiting to cross off. She stood in the back of the formation, the sweat drying on her skin, leaving white salt trails against the green of her fatigues. She felt the tension in the air, the way the other candidates were looking at her, some with awe, but most with a kind of wary resentment. She was the one who was making it harder for everyone else because she wouldn't just break. She was the nail that stood up, and they were all being hit by the hammer that was trying to drive her down. That evening, the black phase of OCS felt like it was shifting into a higher gear. The atmosphere in the barracks was toxic with exhaustion. People were snapping at each other over missing socks or the way someone was snoring. Thorne sat on the edge of her bunk, cleaning her rifle for the 3rd time that day. She did it by touch, her fingers moving over the bolt carrier and the firing pin with the same familiarity she had with a Chevy small block. She could feel the minute burrs in the metal, the places where the carbon was hiding in the recesses of the receiver. Miller sat down on the bunk across from her, her face pale. "He's going to kill you, Evie," Miller whispered. "He's not going to stop until you're gone. Why don't you just?" "I don't know. Let him win one, cry a little, fail a test. Just give him something so he moves on to someone else." Thorne didn't look up from the rifle. "I don't know how to do that." "Everyone knows how to fail," Miller said. "Not on purpose," Thorne replied. "In the garage, if you fail on purpose, someone's brakes go out on the highway. If you fail on purpose, the engine seizes in the middle of a blizzard. You don't play games with things that matter." "This is just OCS," Miller argued. "It's all a game, it's all theater." Thorne finally looked up. Her eyes were hard, the color of cold flint. "Vance isn't playing a game. He's looking for the person he can trust when the theater ends. He thinks I'm a performer. He thinks this," she gestured to her own face, her composed expression, "is an act. He's going to keep pushing until he finds out what's underneath." "What is underneath?" Miller asked, her voice small. Thorne didn't answer. She didn't have the words for it. What was underneath was a vast, quiet space where the rules of the world were laid bare, a grid of cause and effect, of stress and strain, of the inevitable way things broke when they weren't cared for. She was a girl who had learned to survive by being the most reliable component in a broken machine. She didn't know how to be anything else. The next few days were a blur of corrective training. Every time Thorne did something right, the squad was punished. If she was the first one dressed and in formation, the squad had to do wind sprints because they were slower than a girl. If she excelled at the land navigation course, the instructors would move the markers and tell the squad they were lost because Thorne's ego had led them astray. It was a calculated attempt to isolate her, to turn her own peers against her. And it was working. The loyalty that was supposed to be the bedrock of the unit was being eroded by the constant, grinding pressure of Vance's foot on their necks. At the mess hall, Thorne sat alone at the end of the long wooden tables. She ate quickly, efficiently, her eyes on her tray. She could feel the weight of the stares from the other tables. She heard the whispers. She thinks she's better than us. Why won't she just quit? My knees are shot because of her. She took a bite of the dry turkey and the tasteless mashed potatoes, her mind already moving past the insults. She was focused on something else. She was focused on the weather. For the last 48 hours, she had been watching the barometric pressure drop in her head, feeling the change in the moisture levels in the air. The local news on the small TV in the break room had mentioned a system moving in from the Gulf, but they were calling for light rain and maybe some wind. Thorne didn't believe them. She had felt this specific pressure once before, back in 2012, right before a series of tornadoes had leveled half a county in Ohio. It was a heavy, stagnant feeling, like the air was being sucked out of a room. She noticed other things, too. The way the base's emergency sirens were being tested more frequently. The way the officers in the battalion headquarters were moving. Faster, with more urgency, their voices clipped. There was a discrepancy between the official version of reality and the one she was reading in the environment. The threat crystallized on Friday afternoon during the pre-mission briefing for the lanes. The lanes were the final, grueling test of the Black Phase, a 72-hour continuous operation in the deep woods of the Fort Moore training area. They would be evaluated on everything: leadership, tactical proficiency, and endurance. The weather forecast pinned to the briefing board still said scattered showers. Thorne raised her hand. It was the first time she had spoken in a briefing since the first week. Captain Holloway, the company commander, looked at her with a mix of surprise and annoyance. Holloway was a man who prided himself on his open-door policy, but he was also a man who didn't like his schedule being disrupted. "Yes, Candidate Thorne. Sir, the weather forecast is incorrect," she said. The room went silent. Vance, who was standing in the corner with his arms crossed, let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. "Is that so?" Holloway asked, leaning back against his desk. "And where did you get your meteorology degree, Candidate?" "I don't have one, sir, but the pressure is dropping at a rate of 4 millibars an hour. The wind is shifting to the southwest and the humidity is spiking. There's a supercell forming over Alabama. It's going to hit the training area around midnight. It's not a shower, sir. It's a significant weather event." Holloway looked at the official report in his hand, then back at Thorne. "The National Weather Service says otherwise, Thorne, and the post command hasn't issued any warnings. We're on a timeline. We have 200 candidates who need to be evaluated by Monday. We aren't pausing because you have a feeling in your bones." "It's not a feeling, sir. The birds have cleared out of the northern pines. The insects are burrowing. The static in the radio nets is increasing. All the indicators point to a severe storm." Vance stepped forward, his boots clicking on the floor. "Captain, Candidate Thorne is just looking for a way out of the lanes. She knows she's on the bubble. She knows the squad is tired of her leadership. She's trying to sabotage the exercise so she doesn't have to face the music." Holloway nodded, a slow, dismissive gesture. "Take your seat, Thorne. The mission is a go. The buses leave at 1800. If it rains, you'll get wet. That's why we give you a poncho." Thorne sat down. She felt the controlled rage turn into something else, a cold, hard competence. She had seen the failure in the system. The command was blind because they were wedded to a schedule. They were ignoring the reality on the ground because the paperwork said they were safe. It was the same reason engines blew up and garages went under. It was the same reason people died. She looked at Miller, who was sitting 2 rows ahead. Miller looked terrified, not of the storm, but of the lanes themselves. Thorne realized then that the threat wasn't just the weather. It was the fact that the people in charge were willing to risk the safety of the candidates to maintain the illusion of control. And Vance. Vance was the worst of them. He wasn't just ignoring the danger, he was using it as a weapon against her. As they loaded the buses at 1800, the sky was a bruised, sickly purple. The air was dead still, the kind of silence that feels like a held breath. Thorne's pack felt heavier than usual, not because of the gear, but because of the knowledge she was carrying. She had checked her radio 3 times. She had double-checked the seals on her squad's first aid kits. She had quietly tucked an extra compass and a handheld GPS she had liberated from the supply room into her pocket, a violation of the rules that could get her kicked out of the program instantly. But she didn't care about the rules anymore. She cared about the mission, and the mission was survival. Vance stood at the door of the bus as they boarded. He stopped Thorne, his hand on her shoulder. The grip was tight, meant to intimidate. "This is it, Thorne," he whispered. "Out there in the dark, you can't hide behind your silence. Out there, the woods don't care about your patterns. They just eat people like you." "The woods don't care about any of us, drill sergeant," Thorne said, her voice steady. She looked him right in the eye, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something in his expression. Not fear, but a realization. He realized that she wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid for him. The bus lurched into gear, the diesel engine roaring as it pulled away from the barracks. They headed deep into the training area, away from the lights of Mainside, away from the safety of the hospital and the paved roads. As they drove, the first lightning strike flickered on the horizon, a jagged electric blue tear in the fabric of the night. It was far away over the Alabama line, but Thorne felt it in her teeth. The drop-off point was a clearing known as the Bone Yard, a place where old tanks were left to rust as targets. The company spilled out of the buses, the instructors barking orders, the candidates fumbling with their gear in the dark. The wind had started to pick up now, a low moan through the pines that sounded like a warning. "All right, listen up," Captain Halloway shouted over the wind. "You have your objectives, you have your coordinates. The evaluation starts now. We'll be monitoring your progress from the TOC. Don't call for help unless it's a real-world emergency. Go." The squads vanished into the woods, 3-man and 4-man teams spreading out like ink on a wet map. Thorne was paired with Jackson and Miller. It was a deliberate choice by Vance, the 2 people who most resented her leadership. "Which way, Oracle?" Jackson sneered, adjusting the straps of his ruck. Thorne looked at the map, then at the sky. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, huge, warm splatters that hit the dry earth like bullets. "We're not going to the first objective," Thorne said. "What?" Miller gasped. "We have to. If we don't hit the checkpoints, we fail." "The first checkpoint is in a low-lying valley near the creek," Thorne said. "If the storm hits like I think it will, that valley is going to be underwater in 2 hours. We're going to the high ground. We're going to the ridge near Objective 4. "That's 2 miles in the wrong direction," Jackson shouted. "I'm not failing this because you're scared of a little rain. I'm going to the checkpoint." He turned to walk away, his flashlight cutting a weak yellow path through the gathering gloom. "Jackson, stop," Thorne said. "Make me," he threw back over his shoulder. A massive crack of thunder shook the ground, followed by a gust of wind that nearly knocked Miller off her feet. The rain turned from a drizzle to a torrential downpour in a matter of seconds. The scattered showers had arrived, and they were bringing the end of the world with them. Thorne grabbed Miller's arm. She saw the fear in the girl's eyes, the total, paralyzing terror of someone who realizes the system has failed them. "Stay with me," Thorne said. "Do you hear me? Stay on my boot." She looked toward the ridge, her mind already calculating the path. She could hear the sound of the wind rising to a scream, and somewhere in the distance the terrifying, freight train roar of a tornado touching down. The mission had changed. It wasn't about the commission anymore. It wasn't about Vance. It was about the 40 people out in these woods who didn't know what was coming. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the GPS. The screen glowed a pale electric blue. "What are you doing?" Miller cried over the roar of the rain. "That's contraband. You'll be expelled." "I'm not getting expelled," Thorne said, her voice cutting through the storm with a dark, terrifying competence. "I'm going to find the rest of the company before the water rises, and then I'm going to find the drill sergeant." She looked back at the TOC, the small, temporary command post they had passed on the way in. The lights were flickering. The radio antenna was whipping violently in the wind. She knew, with the same certainty she knew a failing engine, that the TOC was about to lose communications. They were on their own. She turned her back on the path and started to run toward the ridge, Miller stumbling behind her. The darkness was absolute now, lit only by the strobe light flashes of lightning that revealed a world being torn apart by the wind. Thorne didn't need the light. She could feel the shape of the land, the flow of the water, the structural integrity of the pines. She was moving at the edge of her capability, her heart a steady, rhythmic thrum in her chest. She reached the top of the first rise and stopped. Below them, the valley where the first checkpoints were located was already beginning to shimmer with rising water. She could see the tiny, flickering lights of other candidates' flashlights, moving like fireflies in a jar. They were walking into a trap. Thorne pulled a flare from her vest, another piece of liberated gear. She didn't hesitate. She struck the cap and fired it into the air. The brilliant red light illuminated the storm, a defiant, bleeding star in the middle of the chaos. "What are you doing?" Miller screamed. "You're giving away our position, the exercise." "The exercise is over," Thorne yelled back. "Tell everyone you see, get to the ridge, get to the high ground." She didn't wait to see if Miller followed. She dived back down into the trees, toward the rising water, toward the people who didn't know they were drowning. She was the only one who saw the pattern. She was the only one who knew how to fix it. And she was going to fix it, even if she had to break every rule in the United States Army to do it. As she reached the edge of the creek, she saw a figure struggling in the mud. It was Vance. He was pinned under a fallen pine tree, the heavy trunk crushing his leg into the rising silt. His aviators were gone, and for the first time she saw his eyes. They were wide, reflecting the lightning, filled with the primal realization of his own mortality. The water was already up to his waist. Thorne stood over him, the rain lashing her face, the flare she had dropped nearby sputtering a dying, crimson light. "Candidate Thorne," he gasped, his voice barely audible over the roar of the flash flood. Get out of here, the talk. Radio's dead, go." Thorne didn't move. She looked at the tree, then at the water, then at the man who had spent the last 6 weeks trying to destroy her. She felt the weight of the moment, the specific, agonizing cost of what it meant to be right. "I'm not going anywhere, drill sergeant," she said. She reached down and grabbed the trunk of the tree. The weight was immense, thousands of pounds of wet wood and gravity. But she didn't look at the weight. She looked for the pivot point. She looked for the place where the system would yield. She found it. "On 3, she said, her voice as cold and certain as the North Star. In that moment, as the Georgia sky opened up to swallow them both, the drill sergeant finally saw what was underneath the silence. And it was more terrifying than any storm. The mud was a living thing, a cold, thick slurry that sucked at Thorne's knees as she dropped beside the pinned drill sergeant. The red Georgia clay, so baked and brittle hours ago, had transformed into a viscous grease that made every movement a gamble. Vance's face was a mask of gray against the dark earth. His teeth gritted so hard she could hear the enamel grind. The pine tree, a loblolly that had stood for 50 years before the wind snapped it like a dry toothpick, was a jagged weight that didn't just pin him. It was actively driving him into the rising water of the creek bed. Thorne didn't look at the water yet, though she could feel the cold edge of it swirling around her thighs, carrying the scent of pulverized pine needles and the metallic tang of lightning. She looked at the tree. She saw it the way she had seen the suspension systems of the rusted-out trucks in Steubenville, as a series of load-bearing points and potential failure vectors. She didn't try to lift it. That was the mistake a person who didn't understand the world would make. You don't fight 1,000 pounds of saturated timber with muscle, you fight it with physics. She felt the trunk, her fingers searching for the pivot, the one place where the earth was firm enough to act as a fulcrum. The tree was caught on a limestone shelf 6 inches above the ground on the opposite side of Vance's leg. It was a lever waiting to be used. "Miller," Thorne shouted, her voice cutting through the roar of the rain with a clarity that silenced the panic in the air. "Get over here." Miller, who had been standing 5 feet away with her hands pressed to her mouth, stumbled forward. She tripped, her face hitting the mud, and for a second Thorne thought she would just stay there, curled in a ball. But the command in Thorne's voice was a tether. Miller scrambled up, her eyes wide and glassy. "I can't, Evie, we have to go, the water." "Shut up and listen," Thorne said. It wasn't an insult, it was a calibration. "I need you to find a sturdy branch. 2, maybe 3 inches thick. Use your bayonet if you have to, but find it now. Go 10 yards up the bank, there's a downed oak. Bring me the longest piece you can carry. Now." Miller vanished into the dark, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. Thorne turned back to Vance. The water was at his chest now. The creek, which had been a dry ditch when they began the exercise, was now a churning vein of brown water, fueled by the 3 inches of rain that had fallen in the last 40 minutes. Vance's hand, slick with mud, reached out and gripped Thorne's forearm. His strength was fading, but the grip was desperate. "Thorne, leave it, you can't. The LMTV is a mile out. Get the squad there, that's an order." "The order is irrelevant, drill sergeant," she said, her voice flat. She was already digging into the mud beneath the limestone shelf, her fingernails tearing, her knuckles bleeding as she cleared space for the lever. "You're a component in this system. If I lose you, the system fails. I don't fail." She didn't say it with pride. She said it with the same clinical detachment she used when telling her father that a cylinder head was warped beyond repair. It was a fact. It was the only thing that mattered. Miller returned, dragging a heavy limb of white oak. She was sobbing, the sound lost in the wind, but she had the wood. Thorne took it, testing the weight. It was solid. She jammed the end of the oak branch under the pine trunk, using the limestone shelf as the fulcrum. "When I lift," Thorne said, "you pull him. Do not pull him by the shoulders. Pull him by the tactical vest. Straight back. Do you understand?" Miller nodded, her breathing coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Thorne adjusted her stance. She planted her feet in the shifting silt, feeling for the solid earth beneath. She took a breath, the cold, wet air burning her lungs, and she let the Thorne silence take over. The world narrowed to the feel of the bark against her palms and the burning tension in her quads. She wasn't a candidate anymore. She wasn't a girl from Ohio. She was a hydraulic jack. She was a gear. She was the force that refused to move. She pushed. The oak branch groaned, the fibers of the wood screaming under the sudden, immense pressure. Thorne's vision blurred, the rain-streaked world turning into a kaleidoscope of gray and black. She felt the pine tree shift, just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough. "Now!" she roared. Miller lunged forward, grabbing the straps of Vance's vest. She pulled with the desperation of someone who knew that if she failed, she would never be able to look at herself in a mirror again. Vance let out a guttural, animalistic shriek as his mangled leg was dragged out from under the bark. The sound was a jagged edge in the night, a reminder of the cost of the rescue. As soon as Miller cleared him, Thorne let go. The oak lever snapped with a crack that sounded like a gunshot, and the pine tree settled back into the mud with a dull, wet thud. The water surged over it instantly, the creek claiming the space where Vance's chest had been seconds before. Thorne didn't stop to breathe. She grabbed Vance's other side, and together, she and Miller dragged him up the steep, slippery embankment. They didn't stop until they reached the ridge, the high ground where the pines were still standing, their roots holding the earth against the onslaught. Vance lay on his back, his breath coming in ragged whistles. His leg was a ruin, the BDU trousers were torn open, and even in the dim light of the lightning, Thorne could see the unnatural angle of the tibia. He was in shock, his skin clammy and pale despite the humidity. "Miller, first aid kit," Thorne commanded. "Pressure dressing on the leg. Use your poncho to keep him as dry as you can. We need to stabilize him before his heart gives out." Miller moved with a newfound focus. The panic was still there, lurking in the corners of her eyes, but she had seen the impossible happen. She had seen Thorne move the earth. Thorne stood up and looked back toward the valley. The flare she had fired earlier had long since died out, but the lightning revealed a terrifying landscape. The lanes had become a series of islands. The low-lying paths were gone, replaced by rushing torrents of water. She could see other flashes now. Not lightning, but the weak, flickering beams of flashlights. The other squads were scattered, isolated, and moving toward the water instead of away from it. They were following the map, and the map was a lie. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the GPS. The coordinates of the TOC were 3 miles to the east, across 2 more creek beds that were likely already impassable. She looked at the screen, then at the sky. The wind was gusting at 50 miles an hour now, the sound a continuous, low-frequency rumble that made the very air vibrate. This was the institutional failure she had predicted. The command had relied on a forecast that was 3 hours old and a chain of command that was built for the sunshine. They were waiting for orders that weren't coming because the radio towers on the ridge were likely the first things to go down. 2 miles to the north at the Tactical Operations Center, Captain Holloway was staring at a blank monitor. The generator had hummed its last breath 5 minutes ago, poisoned by a mixture of water and old fuel in the external tank. The room, a temporary plywood structure reinforced with sandbags, was filled with the smell of wet paper and ozone. "Sir, I've got nothing on the PRC 152s, First Lieutenant Garza said, his voice tight. He was clicking the handset of the long-range radio, the static a mocking hiss in the darkness. "The repeater on Hill 302 must be down. We're blind." Holloway rubbed his face, his palms coming away wet. He was a man who believed in the grid. He believed in the plan. He had spent 10 years in the Army following the steps, and the steps had always led him to the right conclusion. but the steps didn't account for a supercell that moved faster than the NWS could track. "What about the LMTVs?" Holloway asked. "Stuck, sir. Sergeant Davis tried to move the first one 5 minutes ago. The road turned into a river. He's buried to the axles. We can't get to the candidates, and they can't get to us." Holloway looked out the small, plexiglass window. A flash of lightning revealed the clearing where the candidates were supposed to assemble. It was empty. Somewhere out there, 200 men and women were wandering through a swamp in the middle of a hurricane, following a training schedule that had just become a death warrant. "Candidate Thorne," Holloway whispered to himself. "Sir?" Garza asked. "She told us," Holloway said, his voice hollow. "She stood right in front of me and told me the pressure was dropping. I told her she was a liability." The realization was a cold stone in his stomach. He hadn't just ignored a warning, he had punished the person who gave it. If people died tonight, it wouldn't be because of the weather. It would be because he had valued the protocol over the reality. He looked at his hands, the clean, manicured hands of an officer who had spent too much time behind a desk. "We need to get a runner to the ridge," Holloway said, his voice regaining some of its steel. "If we can't radio them, we signal them. We use every flare we have. We tell them to move to the high ground at Objective 4. "Sir, with all due respect," Garza said, "nobody's making it to the ridge in this. The wind will strip the skin right off you." "Someone has to," Holloway said, but he didn't move toward the door. He stood in the center of the dark TOC, a commander without a command, waiting for the world to tell him what to do next. Back on the ridge, Thorne was making a different kind of decision. She had finished helping Miller stabilize Vance's leg. The drill sergeant was conscious, but he was fading. He needed a medevac, and he needed it an hour ago. "Miller, listen to me," Thorne said, leaning in close so her voice wouldn't be lost. "You're the fastest runner in the company. You were state champion in Oregon. You told me that." Miller nodded, her face wet with rain. Yeah, I was. I need you to run, not to the TOC, to the main road, Highway 27. It's 4 miles from here. If you stay on the ridge, the ground is firm. You don't cross the water, you stay high." "But the exercise?" "The exercise is dead, Miller. Vance is dying. You get to the road, you flag down anything with wheels. You tell them there are 200 people trapped in the Pine Barrens and the Cotter are incapacitated. You tell them we need the National Guard or the base emergency services with tracked vehicles. Do you understand?" "What about you?" Miller asked, her hand reaching out to grab Thorne's sleeve. "You can't stay here alone with him." "I'm not staying here," Thorne said. She looked toward the flashes of light in the valley. "I'm going down there. I'm going to gather the rest of the squad. If they stay in the low ground, they're going to be swept away when the reservoir upstream hits capacity." "The reservoir?" Vance croaked from the ground. Thorne looked at him. "The heavy rains are hitting the north end of the base. The dam at Taylor Lake is an earthen berm. It's 50 years old. It wasn't built for a 12-inch surge. It's going to breach Drill Sergeant, and when it does, this valley becomes a lake." Vance looked at her, and for the first time, the Thorne silence made sense to him. She wasn't being stoic, she was processing. She was a computer that had already calculated the end of the world while he was busy worrying about the shine on her boots. "Go, Miller," Vance said, his voice a dry rasp. That's an order. Follow Thorne's lead." Miller let go of Thorne's sleeve. She stood up, her thin frame shaking, but her jaw was set. She took a deep breath, adjusted her soaked cap, and looked at Thorne. "I'll find them, Evie, I promise." "Don't promise," Thorne said. "Just run." Miller turned and vanished into the trees. She didn't look back. She ran with the long, easy stride of a professional, her body disappearing into the gloom. Thorne turned back to Vance. She reached into her ruck and pulled out her survival blanket, the thin, crinkly mylar sheet that every candidate was issued. She wrapped it around him, tucking the edges under his body to trap what little heat he had left. "I'll be back," she said. "Thorne," Vance called out as she turned to leave. She stopped. The radio. "In my vest, the emergency frequency. 121. 5, I couldn't get it to work. Maybe you can." Thorne knelt and pulled the small handheld radio from his vest. It was a standard issue, ruggedized but battered. She turned it over in her hands, her fingers feeling the subtle grit in the buttons. She didn't try to turn it on. She held it to her ear and shook it gently. She heard the faint metallic rattle of a loose connection. "The antenna lead is snapped," she said. "Inside the housing. Can you fix it?" Thorne pulled her multi-tool from her belt. "I don't have a soldering iron, but I have 550 cord and a copper cleaning rod from my rifle kit." She worked with a speed that was hypnotic. She unscrewed the housing, her hands moving with a precision that the storm couldn't touch. She stripped a piece of copper wire from her cleaning kit, bypassed the broken internal lead and lashed it to the antenna with a piece of paracord. It was a Steubenville special, a repair held together by spit and desperation, but it was a closed circuit. She turned the power on. The screen flickered to life. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," she said into the handset. "This is Candidate Evelyn Thorne, 2nd Platoon, Ox. We have a mass casualty situation in the Pine Barrens, Fort Moore. Multiple personnel trapped by flash flooding. One priority, one casualty with a crushed limb. Requesting immediate aerial extraction or tracked vehicle support. Do you copy?" Static. A long, agonizing stretch of white noise that felt like the sound of the world ending. And then a voice. Faint, distorted, but unmistakably human. "This is Moore Tower, Candidate. Repeat your coordinates. We are receiving. Reports of severe weather. All aircraft are grounded. Say again, all aircraft are grounded." "This isn't a training exercise, Tower," Thorne said, her voice rising for the first time. "The Taylor Lake Dam is going to breach. If you don't get people in here now, you're going to be counting bodies by morning. My coordinates are grid Alpha Tango 69 or 42. I am marking the ridge with a strobe. Do you copy? Copy Alpha Tango. Receiving you, Thorne. We are. Attempting to notify command. Stay on this frequency." Thorne handed the radio to Vance. "Keep talking to them. If the signal fades, move the antenna toward the north. I have to go." "Thorne," Vance said, his voice stronger now, fueled by the hope of the radio's hum. Why didn't you just let me wash you out? You're too good for this. You could have been anything." Thorne looked out at the dark woods, the place where she was about to risk everything for a group of people who had spent the last month hating her. "I like the way the Army works, Drill Sergeant," she said. "The parts are supposed to fit together, and when they don't, someone has to be the one to fix them." She turned and ran down the slope, leaving the safety of the ridge behind. The descent into the valley was a nightmare of shifting earth and hidden obstacles. Thorne moved with a predatory focus, her eyes scanning for the specific patterns of human movement. She found the first group a half-mile down, 4 candidates huddled under a rock overhang that was rapidly becoming a waterfall. Among them was Jackson, the former quarterback. He was sitting in the mud, his head in his hands, his bravado stripped away by the cold. "Move!" Thorne shouted, stepping into their small circle of misery. Jackson looked up, his face etched with a mixture of shock and resentment. "Thorne, what the hell are you doing?" Vance said to stay put. "Vance is pinned on the ridge with a broken leg," Thorne said, grabbing Jackson by the collar and hauling him to his feet. "And the ridge is the only thing that's going to be above water in 20 minutes. Get your gear and follow me." "You're not in charge, Thorne," one of the other candidates, a guy named Peterson, said. He was shivering uncontrollably. "We have to wait for the Cotter." Thorne stepped toward him, her face inches from his. The lightning flashed, and in that second, Peterson saw the dark competence that Vance had sensed. He saw a woman who had already moved a tree and rebuilt a radio and calculated the failure of a dam. He saw the only person who knew the way out. "The Cotter are blind," Thorne said. "The TOC is dark. I am the only one who knows the grid. If you stay here, you die. If you follow me, you have a chance. Make a choice. Now." She didn't wait for them. She turned and headed toward the next set of lights she saw. One by one, the 4 men picked up their rucks and followed her. They moved like ghosts through the rising water, Thorne leading them through the brush, her mind mapping the terrain in 3 dimensions. She knew where the old logging roads were, the ones that had been decommissioned years ago, but still had a base of crushed stone that wouldn't wash away. As she gathered more people, 12, then 20, then 30, the group became a column of desperation. Thorne was at the head, her small, light-colored frame a beacon in the darkness. She wasn't shouting anymore. She didn't need to. The gravity of her presence was enough to pull them along. She led them across the first creek bed, the water now waist-deep and pulling with a terrifying force. She formed a human chain, putting the strongest men in the center and the smallest women at the ends, anchored to the trees. She stood in the middle of the torrent, the water slamming into her chest, her hands gripping the straps of the candidates as they passed. She felt the weight of their fear, the way their bodies trembled as they fought the current. "Don't look at the water," she yelled. "Look at the person in front of you. Keep moving." They reached the other side, a ragtag collection of the best and brightest, who were now nothing more than cold, wet animals. They were a mile from the ridge when the sound changed. It wasn't the wind anymore. It wasn't the thunder. It was a low, visceral growl that felt like it was coming from the center of the earth. It was the sound of 1 billion gallons of water suddenly finding a new path. The Taylor Lake Dam had breached. "Run!" Thorne screamed. "To the ridge! Don't stop for anything! Get to the high ground!" The column broke into a frantic scramble. People were dropping their rucks, discarding their rifles, shedding anything that slowed them down. Thorne stayed at the back, ushering the stragglers, her eyes fixed on the northern horizon. In the distance, she could see a wall of white foam and debris moving through the trees, a literal mountain of water that was erasing the forest as it moved. She saw a girl, Candidate Rivera, trip and fall, her boot caught in a tangle of roots. Rivera was screaming, her eyes fixed on the approaching wall of water. Thorne didn't think. She dived toward the girl, her multi-tool out in a second. She sliced through the laces of the boot, the leather giving way under the sharp blade. "Get up!" Thorne yelled, hauling Rivera to her feet. The girl was frozen, her legs refusing to move. Thorne didn't have time for a conversation. She threw the girl over her shoulder in a fireman's carry, the weight of the Candidate adding to the 60 pounds of Thorne's own gear. She ran. Every step was a battle against the mud and the exhaustion that was finally beginning to claw at her muscles. Her lungs were on fire, and her vision was narrowing to a small, dark tunnel. She could hear the water behind her, the sound of trees snapping like toothpicks, the roar of 1,000 freight trains. She reached the base of the ridge, the steep incline that led to Vance and the radio. The rest of the company was already clawing their way up, a frantic mass of humanity reaching for the safety of the heights. Thorne started up the slope, her knees buckling under the weight of Rivera. She was halfway up when she felt the first surge of the flood hit her ankles. The water was cold, colder than the rain, and it carried the smell of the deep earth. It pulled at her, trying to drag her back into the abyss. She gripped a handful of pine needles and dirt, her fingers screaming as she pulled herself and Rivera another 3 feet up. She didn't look back, she didn't look up, she just moved. A hand reached down from above. It was Jackson. The arrogant quarterback, the man who had spent the last month trying to make her life a living hell, was leaning over the edge of a rock outcropping, his arm extended. "Give her to me," Jackson yelled. Thorne shoved Rivera upward, and Jackson hauled the girl up like she was a rag doll. Then he reached back for Thorne. She took his hand, and he pulled her up onto the flat surface of the ridge just as the main surge of the flood slammed into the base of the hill. The impact shook the ground, a violent tremor that sent a shower of pine cones and needles down upon them. They stood there, 30 candidates and 1 injured drill sergeant, watching as the world they had been training in vanished. The lanes were gone. The valley was a churning, violent sea of brown water and debris. The talk, the trucks, the checkpoints, all of it was under 10 feet of water. Vance was sitting up, the radio still clutched in his hand. He looked at Thorne, his eyes wide and unreadable. "Tower says the National Guard is 10 minutes out," he said, his voice trembling. "They're bringing in the Chinooks. They saw your strobe." Thorne didn't say anything. She walked to the edge of the ridge and sat down, her legs dangling over the precipice. She watched the water. She watched the way it swirled around the tops of the trees that were still standing, a complex, terrifying system of fluid dynamics. She felt a presence beside her. It was Jackson. He sat down, his shoulders slumped, his face streaked with tears and mud. "I thought you were crazy," he whispered. "In the briefing, I thought you were just, I don't know, trying to be the smartest person in the room." "I wasn't trying to be anything, Jackson," Thorne said, her voice barely a whisper. "How did you know?" he asked. "About the dam, about the pressure, how did you know?" Thorne looked at her hands. They were raw, the fingernails gone, the knuckles swollen and bruised. They were the hands of a mechanic. They were the hands of a woman who knew that if you didn't pay attention to the small sounds, the big ones would eventually kill you. "Everything has a breaking point," she said. "If you listen long enough, it'll tell you exactly when it's going to happen." They sat in silence as the first sound of the heavy-lift helicopters began to thrum in the distance, the rhythmic, heart-stopping beat of the Chinooks cutting through the storm. The searchlights began to sweep the ridge, long, brilliant fingers of white light that turned the rain into silver. The rescue was beginning. The lanes were over. But as the first helicopter hovered over the ridge, the downdraft whipping the trees into a frenzy, Thorne saw something that made her heart stop. In the middle of the flooded valley, half a mile away, a single red light was blinking. It was the strobe from a downed aircraft. A medevac bird had tried to get in before the weather grounded the fleet, and it was down in the water, caught in the debris of the Taylor Lake breach. Thorne stood up. Her body was screaming for rest, her mind was a blur of exhaustion, but the Thorne silence was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She looked at Vance. He saw the look in her eyes. "No, Thorne," he said, shaking his head. "Don't, you've done enough, the guard will get them." "The guard is landing on the ridge," Thorne said, her eyes fixed on the blinking red light. They won't see that strobe from the air, not with the spray from the flood, and by the time they do, that bird will be under the silt. She looked at Jackson. "I need your 550 cord," she said. "All of it, and your life vest." "Thorne, you can't swim that," Jackson said, his voice rising in panic. "The current." "I'm not swimming it," she said. She looked at a group of fallen logs that had jammed against the side of the ridge, held there by the force of the water. They were tied together by a tangle of wild grapevines and debris. It was a natural raft, a temporary platform in the middle of the chaos. "I'm going to ride the debris line," she said. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't look back at the helicopters that were finally touching down. She moved toward the edge of the water, her mind already calculating the speed of the current and the angle of the intercept. She was a girl from Steubenville, Ohio, who knew how to fix things. And right now, there was a broken system in the middle of that water, and she was the only component that could reach it. As she stepped into the churning brown darkness, the last thing she heard was the sound of her own name being called. Not as a candidate, not as a subordinate, but as a person. "Thorne!" She didn't turn back, she dived. The water was a wall of ice, but as she surfaced and grabbed onto the floating timber, she felt the familiar heavy weight of the world settle into place. The system was failing, the institutional failure was complete, and she was the only thing left that still worked. But as she drifted away from the ridge into the heart of the flood, she saw something move in the water ahead of her, something large, dark, and faster than the current. It wasn't debris. It was a second surge. The dam hadn't just breached, it had collapsed entirely, and the wall of water coming toward her was 40 feet high. The water didn't hit like a liquid. It hit like a mountain made of wet concrete and shattered timber. When the second surge from the Taylor Lake collapse reached the bend in the creek, it wasn't a wave so much as a vertical wall of chocolate-colored froth, carrying the uprooted corpses of 50-year-old oaks and the twisted remains of a chain-link perimeter fence. Thorne felt the impact in her marrow before she felt it on her skin. She didn't struggle against the initial shove. To struggle was to be torn apart by the sheer kinetic energy of the flow. Instead, she became a piece of the system, tucking her chin, drawing her limbs tight to her core, and letting the current take the raft of logs she had claimed. The Thorne silence in her head wasn't quiet anymore. It was a screaming calculation of vectors, velocities, and the structural integrity of the grapevines holding her makeshift vessel together. She was airborne for a second, the raft tilting at a 40-degree angle as it rode the crest of the surge, and then she was slammed back down into the churning abyss. The sound was deafening, a low-frequency thrum that vibrated the very air in her lungs, the sound of a landscape being erased. She gripped the rough bark of the center log, her fingers bleeding where the wood fibers sliced through her skin. She wasn't thinking about the cold. She wasn't thinking about the ridge she had just left behind or the 30 candidates watching her vanish into the dark. She was looking for the red light. The strobe was gone. The wall of water had rolled over the valley floor, and for a terrifying minute there was nothing but the black expanse of the flood and the white flashes of lightning reflecting off the debris. Then, a flicker. 300 yards downstream, a rhythmic, pulsing crimson glow cut through the spray. The medevac bird was still there, but it was no longer stationary. It was being pushed, caught in the grip of the surge, and dragged toward a narrow gorge where the creek bed dropped another 50 feet into a rocky basin. If the airframe hit those rocks, it wouldn't matter how well-built a Black Hawk was. It would be a tin can in a trash compactor. Thorne shifted her weight, moving to the edge of the raft. She saw a downed loblolly pine, its root ball still heavy with Georgia clay, acting as a natural rudder in the current. She kicked off from her center log, her boots finding purchase on the slick, barkless surface of the pine. She used the weight of the tree to steer, leaning her body into the flow, forcing the debris line to intercept the path of the blinking red light. It was a gamble of pure physics. She was a 130-pound woman trying to influence the trajectory of 10,000 pounds of wood and water. She hit the helicopter's tail boom with a bone-jarring thud. The impact sent a jolt of white-hot pain through her left shoulder, a sickening pop that told her the joint had partially subluxed. She didn't scream. She didn't have the breath for it. She reached out with her right hand, her fingers catching the jagged edge of a stabilizer fin. The metal was cold and sharp, slicing into her palm, but she held on. She hauled herself up, her boots scrambling for grip on the rivet-studded skin of the aircraft. The Black Hawk was nose down in the water, its main rotors snapped off and trailing in the current like broken wings. The cabin was half submerged, the water rushing through the open doors with the force of a fire hose. Thorne climbed toward the cockpit, her movements deliberate and slow despite the chaos around her. She could see the pilot through the reinforced glass. A man in a flight suit, his helmet gone, his head slumped against the side window. He wasn't moving. She reached the sliding cabin door. Inside, the world was a nightmare of floating medical gear, green nylon webbing, and the smell of JP-8 fuel. A man, a flight medic, his name tag reading Vance though he wasn't the drill sergeant, was pinned against the ceiling of the inverted cabin, his leg caught in a tangle of downed litters and specialized equipment. "Hey!" Thorne shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the water. The medic's eyes snapped open. They were wide, dilated with shock. "The pilot! Get the pilot! The nose is filling!" Thorne didn't waste time talking. She dropped into the cabin, the water instantly rising to her chest. It was freezing, a cold that felt like it was trying to stop her heart, but she pushed through it. She moved toward the cockpit, her mind already analyzing the structure of the airframe. The nose was wedged against a submerged rock, which was the only thing keeping the bird from being swept over the falls, but the pressure of the water was slowly crushing the plexiglass. She reached the pilot. He was conscious now, but his legs were pinned under the crumpled instrument panel. The dark competence took over, that internal mechanic's eye that saw the world in terms of leverage and stress points. She saw that the cyclic, the control stick between the pilot's legs, had been driven back and down, acting as a deadbolt. "Don't move," Thorne said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command that carried the weight of absolute certainty. She reached into her vest and pulled out her multi-tool. She didn't try to pry the panel. She went for the pins in the pilot's seat. If she could slide the seat back 2 inches, the angle of his legs would change and the pressure would release. But the seat track was jammed with silt and debris. She knelt in the rising water, her head dipping below the surface for 10 seconds at a time as she worked the tool into the track, clearing the grit with her bare fingers. The water was at the pilot's chin now. He was gasping, his hands clawing at the ceiling. "It's no use. It's filling. Just go." Thorne ignored him. She found the blockage, a flattened brass casing from a flare gun that had been stepped on and wedged into the rail. She didn't have the leverage to pull it. She looked around the cabin, her eyes landing on a heavy oxygen canister that had broken loose. She grabbed it, the weight of the steel nearly dragging her under. She used the canister as a hammer, slamming it against the back of the seat rail. Once, twice. On the third strike, the casing deformed and popped free. "Now!" Thorne yelled. She grabbed the pilot by the shoulders and hauled back. The seat slid with a metallic shriek, and the pilot's legs came free with a wet sucking sound. He collapsed into the water, and Thorne dragged him back into the main cabin where the medic was still struggling against the tangled litters. "Can you stand?" Thorne asked the pilot. I think my ribs are gone," he wheezed, his face a mask of agony. "But I can move." "Help him," Thorne said, pointing to the medic. She didn't stay to watch them. She climbed back out onto the exterior of the bird. The sound of the waterfall was louder now, a deep, visceral growl that meant the rock holding them was starting to give way. The entire airframe groaned, a sound of metal under impossible tension. She looked upstream. A second mass of debris, a tangle of power lines and a transformer, was barreling toward them. If it hit the Black Hawk, it would act as a wrecking ball. Thorne looked at the winch cable. It was still attached to the side of the bird, the hook dangling in the water. She grabbed the cable and began to pull. The internal motor was dead, but the manual override was a simple mechanical crank. She threw her weight into it, her shoulders screaming in protest, the sublux joint grinding against the socket. Every rotation of the crank was a battle, a physical price she paid in flashes of white light behind her eyes. She wasn't just pulling a cable, she was creating a tether. She saw a massive oak tree 30 feet away, its trunk thick and deeply rooted, standing like a sentinel against the flood. If she could get the cable around that tree, she could anchor the bird. She could create a pivot point that would swing the helicopter out of the main current and into the slack water behind the ridge. She took the hook and dived. The water was a chaotic mess of silt and branches. Thorne was tossed like a rag doll, her body slamming into submerged rocks, the air being driven from her lungs. She reached the tree, her hands finding the rough bark. She wrapped the cable around the trunk, the steel wire biting into the wood. She fumbled with the hook, her fingers numb and uncooperative. A branch, the size of a man's thigh, slammed into her side. She felt her ribs snap, a distinct, sickening crunch that robbed her of her breath. She didn't let go. She forced her hands to move, clicking the hook into place just as the second mass of debris hit the helicopter. The cable snapped taut with a sound like a cello string breaking. The Black Hawk didn't shatter. Instead, it swung. The anchor held, and the force of the current, combined with the angle of the cable, pulled the nose of the bird out of the rocks and into the slower water near the bank. Thorne clung to the tree, her chest heaving, every breath a jagged blade of pain in her side. She watched as the helicopter settled into the silt near the edge of the ridge, the pilot and the medic scrambling out of the side door and onto the firm ground. They were safe. The system was stable. She tried to pull herself up the tree, but her left arm wouldn't respond. The shoulder was fully out of the socket now, the muscles spasming in a way that made her vision swim. She leaned her forehead against the bark, the thorn silence finally beginning to fray at the edges. She was cold, a deep, penetrating cold that felt like it had reached her bones. "Thorne!" The voice was distant, muffled by the sound of the water. She looked up. High above, on the crest of the ridge, she could see the silhouettes of the other candidates. They were pointing, their voices a faint chorus in the wind. And then the sky exploded with light. The first Chinook had arrived. The massive, twin-rotor helicopter hovered 50 feet above the water, its searchlights cutting through the rain like the eyes of a god. The downdraft was a hurricane in itself, flattening the grass on the ridge and whipping the water into a frenzy of white foam. A rescue technician, a PJ in a black wetsuit, began to descend on a hoist, his movements smooth and professional. Thorne didn't wait for him. She knew the tree she was holding onto was being undermined by the current. She could feel the roots shifting, the earth beneath her feet dissolving into nothing. She let go of the tree and began to swim toward the bank, using her one good arm to paddle through the slurry. She reached the shore 20 yards downstream from the Black Hawk. She crawled out of the mud, her movements animalistic and slow. She didn't stop until she was 20 feet from the water's edge. She collapsed onto her back, the rain pelting her face, the cold mud a bed she never wanted to leave. Footsteps, heavy rhythmic thuds on the wet earth. "Candidate, can you hear me?" It was the PJ. He knelt beside her, his face obscured by a visor, his hands moving over her with practiced efficiency. "I'm fine," Thorne rasped. It was a lie, a blatant structural lie, but she said it with the same clinical detachment she used for everything else. "You're not fine, kid," the PJ said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Your shoulder's gone and your ribs are a mess. How the hell did you get that cable around the tree?" Thorne didn't answer. She looked past him toward the ridge. She saw the pilot and the medic being loaded into a Stokes litter. She saw the 30 candidates from her company being ushered toward the Chinooks, their faces pale and haunted. She saw Vance, the drill sergeant, being carried on a stretcher, his eyes fixed on her. She had done it. She had predicted the failure, she had mitigated the damage, and she had saved the components that mattered. But as she lay there, the cost began to settle in. It wasn't just the pain in her side or the ruin of her shoulder. It was the realization that she was no longer just a candidate. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She had shown them what she was capable of, and in the military, that kind of capability was a double-edged sword. They would thank her today, but tomorrow they would fear the fact that she had been right when they were wrong. The PJ signaled to the Chinook, and the hoist began to lift. Thorne felt the harness tighten around her chest, the pressure on her broken ribs making her gasp for air. She was lifted into the sky, the flooded valley shrinking beneath her. From this height, she could see the full scale of the disaster. The pine barrens were gone, replaced by a vast, dark lake. The Taylor Lake Dam was a jagged scar in the earth, a monument to the institutional arrogance that had ignored the warnings. She was pulled into the belly of the Chinook, the interior a cacophony of shouting voices, the smell of hydraulic fluid, and the intense heat of the engines. The other candidates were there, huddled in space blankets, their eyes wide as they watched her being lowered onto a litter. Jackson was the first one to reach her. He didn't say anything. He just took off his own dry space blanket and draped it over her, his hands shaking. He looked at her raw, bleeding fingers, at the way her left arm hung limp and useless, and he looked away. He couldn't meet her eyes. "Thorne," he whispered, the sound lost to everyone but her. "I'm sorry." She didn't ask what he was sorry for. She knew. He was sorry for doubting her. He was sorry for being part of the system that had tried to break her. And he was sorry because he knew that after tonight, she would never be one of them again. She was something else, something they didn't have a name for yet. The flight to the hospital at Fort Moore was a blur of morphine and the rhythmic thrum of the rotors. Thorne drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind replaying the moment the cable snapped taut. She saw the vectors. She saw the stress points. She saw the way the world worked and the way it failed. When they landed on the helipad, the air was still thick with rain, but the wind had died down. The supercell had passed, leaving behind a world that was quiet and broken. Thorne was wheeled into the emergency room, the bright fluorescent lights a physical assault on her eyes. She saw Captain Holloway standing in the hallway. He was still in his soaked BDUs, his face haggard and aged 10 years in a single night. He saw her, and for a second the officer's mask slipped. He looked at her with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. He knew what he had done. He knew that the report he would have to write would either be his salvation or his professional execution. He stepped toward her litter as the orderlies pushed her past. "Candidate Thorne," he said, his voice cracking. She looked at him. She didn't salute. She didn't speak. She just watched him with those pale, steady eyes, the eyes of a woman who had seen the bottom of the world and decided she didn't like the way it was built. "The National Guard commander. He wants to talk to you," Holloway said. "He said what you did. It shouldn't have been possible." "Physics doesn't care about what's possible, Captain," Thorne said, her voice a dry rasp. "It only cares about what's true." She was wheeled into a trauma bay, and the curtain was pulled shut, isolating her from the chaos of the hospital. A nurse began to cut away her OCS uniform, the soaked, mud-caked fabric that represented the life she had been trying to build. Thorne watched the scissors move, the green cloth falling to the floor in wet heaps. She was stripped bare, her body a map of the night's violence. The bruises were already turning a deep, sickly purple, and the lacerations on her hands were weeping. But as the nurse began to clean the wounds, Thorne didn't flinch. She sat there in the middle of the sterile, white room, a small, broken girl from Ohio who had just moved the earth. The doctor came in, a major with graying hair and a tired smile. He looked at her x-rays, then at her. "You're lucky to be alive, Thorne," he said. "3 broken ribs, a grade 3 shoulder separation, and a moderate concussion. You're going to be in a sling for a month at least." "Will I graduate?" she asked. The doctor paused, his hand on the chart. He looked at her with a sadness that he couldn't quite hide. "That's not up to me, candidate. That's up to the board. But I'll tell you one thing. I've been in the Army 20 years, and I've never seen a candidate survive a debris flow, let alone pull 2 men out of a downed bird." "The system failed, Doc," she said. "I just filled the gap." "Sometimes the gap is where the best people get lost," he said quietly. He left her then, the door clicking shut. Thorne lay back on the thin hospital mattress, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. The morphine was starting to take hold, a warm, heavy blanket that softened the edges of the pain. She felt her muscles finally begin to relax, the Thorne silence returning, but it was different now. It wasn't a tool for calculation. It was a shield. She knew what was coming. She knew that by morning the investigation would begin. They would look at the weather reports, the orders Holloway had given, and the decisions she had made. They would try to find a way to make the reality fit the protocol. They would try to explain how a candidate with a history of insubordination had ended up being the only hero in a valley full of failures. And they would realize that they couldn't. She was a variable they hadn't accounted for. She was the ghost in the machine, the component that worked when the rest of the engine seized. And the military didn't know what to do with components it couldn't control. Hours later, the sun began to rise over Fort Moore. The light was pale and watery, reflecting off the puddles on the tarmac outside the hospital window. Thorne was awake, her arm immobilized in a heavy black sling, her chest wrapped in tight bandages. She was staring at the door, waiting. She knew the sound of those boots before they even reached her room. The rhythmic, heavy click of a command sergeant major's stride. The door opened. It wasn't a sergeant major. It was a woman. She was wearing Class A's, the silver stars on her shoulders catching the morning light. Brigadier General Sarah Vance, no relation to the drill sergeant, but the commander of the OCS school. She was a legend in the branch, a woman who had fought her way up through the infantry back when the doors were still officially closed. The general walked to the foot of the bed and stood there, her hands clasped behind her back. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just looked at Thorne, her eyes scanning the bruises and the bandages with a clinical intensity. "I just came from the ridge," the general said. Her voice was like gravel and honey, smooth but with a dangerous edge. "I talked to Drill Sergeant Vance, I talked to the pilot, and I talked to a candidate named Jackson." Thorne waited. She didn't offer an explanation. She didn't beg for her career. "Jackson told me that you saw the storm coming 3 hours before the first drop," the general continued. "He said you told them the pressure was falling. He said you tried to tell Captain Holloway." "I did," Thorne said, "and Holloway told you to get back in line." "Yes, ma'am." The general stepped closer, her face inches from Thorne's. "Do you know what the cost of being right is, candidate?" "I'm starting to get an idea, ma'am." "The cost of being right is that you make everyone else wrong," the general said. "And in this man's army, people don't like being wrong, especially people with bars and leaves on their shoulders. They're going to look for a reason to wash you out. They're going to say you left your post. They're going to say you acted without orders and endangered yourself and the mission." "I didn't have a post, ma'am," Thorne said, her voice steady. "The mission had already failed. I was just recovery." The general's eyes flickered, a tiny spark of something that might have been respect or perhaps just recognition. "You're a mechanic, aren't you, Thorne, from Ohio?" "Yes, ma'am. My father was a mechanic," the general said. "He used to say that you can't fix a broken engine by pretending the parts are still good. You have to pull the whole thing apart and find the one piece that's causing the friction." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're the friction, Thorne. You're the piece that doesn't fit. And right now, the entire chain of command is trying to figure out if they should replace you or if they should rebuild the whole damn engine around you." "What do you think, ma'am?" Thorne asked. The general straightened up, her face returning to its mask of command. "I think you're a liability. I think you're dangerous. And I think if I had 10 more like you, I wouldn't have spent the last 6 hours looking at a map of a flooded valley." She turned to leave but stopped at the door. "The investigation starts at 0900. Holloway is already in the hot seat. You have 2 hours to get your story straight, candidate, not the truth, the story, because if you tell them what you told me, they'll crucify you for being smarter than them." "I don't have a story, ma'am," Thorne said. "I only have the physics." The general looked at her one last time, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Then God help you, Thorne, because physics is the only thing in this world that doesn't care about politics." The door closed, leaving Thorne alone in the quiet room. She looked at her hand, the right one, the one that wasn't in the sling. Her fingers were still stained with the red clay of the Pine Barrens, the mud etched into the lines of her skin like a permanent map. She knew she wouldn't change a single thing. She knew that if she were back in that valley with the water rising and the trees snapping, she would dive in again. Not because she wanted to be a hero, and not because she wanted to prove Holloway wrong. She would do it because the system was broken, and she was the only one who knew how to fix it. The cost didn't matter. The standing didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the weight of the cable in her hand and the feeling of the bird swinging into the slack water. She closed her eyes and let the Thorne silence take her. But as she drifted off, she heard a sound in the hallway, the sound of many footsteps moving in unison. It wasn't the rhythmic stride of a general or the frantic rush of an ER nurse. It was the candidates. They were standing in the hallway, 30 men and women in soaked, muddy uniforms, refusing to leave. They were waiting for her. They weren't waiting for a hero, and they weren't waiting for a graduate. They were waiting for the woman who had seen the world ending and told them where to stand. Thorne listened to the sound of their breathing through the door, a low, steady rhythm that matched her own. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just a component. She was the center of the system. And she knew with the terrifying clarity of a woman who sees the truth that the reckoning was only just beginning. The flood was over, but the fire was coming. She adjusted her sling, winced at the flare of pain in her ribs, and waited for the clock to hit 0900. She was ready. She had the physics on her side. And in a world built on lies and protocol, that was the most dangerous weapon of all. Outside, the first Chinook of the morning took off, its rotors beating against the humid Georgia air. Thorne watched it go, a dark shape against the rising sun, and she felt the familiar heavy weight of the mission settle back into her chest. She wasn't a candidate anymore. She was the one who survived, and that, she realized, was a cost she would be paying for the rest of her life. The silence in the room was absolute, a perfect crystalline vacuum. Thorne stared at the white wall, her mind already beginning to map out the investigation. She saw the questions they would ask. She saw the traps they would set. She saw the vectors of their logic. She would meet them. She would answer them. And she would do it with the same cold, sharp precision she had used to move the tree. Because Evelyn Thorne didn't fail, and she didn't break. She just waited for the world to catch up to what she already knew. The first thing Evelyn Thorne noticed about the recovery ward at Martin Army Community Hospital was that the clock on the far wall was 3 seconds slow. A mechanical failure that bothered her more than the 3 broken ribs screaming against her lungs every time she took a breath. It was 04:12 on a Friday morning, and the world was reduced to the sterile smell of industrial lemon cleaner, the rhythmic hiss of a nearby oxygen concentrator, and the crushing weight of a heavy black sling immobilizing her left arm. She lay perfectly still, her eyes tracking the second hand as it struggled through its flawed arc, calculating the cumulative error over 24 hours. 2 minutes and 24 seconds. In a system built on precision, that kind of drift was how people died, though she was starting to realize that most of the people running the United States Army were perfectly comfortable living in the drift. She hadn't slept, not really. Every time her heart rate dipped toward the threshold of REM, the Thorne silence in her head was replaced by the visceral thrum of the Taylor Lake Dam collapsing, the sound of a mountain turning into a liquid wrecking ball. She could still feel the grit of the red Georgia clay under her fingernails, a physical residue that the nurses hadn't been able to scrub away with their antiseptic wipes. She was a candidate who had survived a catastrophic failure of leadership and physics, but as she sat in the pre-dawn grayness of the ward, she didn't feel like a survivor. She felt like a crime scene that the institution was currently trying to cordon off before too many people saw the bodies. A nurse entered at 0500 to check her vitals, her movements efficient and weary. She didn't look Thorne in the eye. People at Fort Moore were already talking. The story of the ghost of the Pine Barrens had traveled from the flight line to the mess halls before the sun had even touched the horizon. The nurse wrapped the blood pressure cuff around Thorne's right arm, the Velcro tearing the silence like a gunshot. "The doctor will be in at 0700, the nurse said, her voice a flat Midwestern rasp. "And there's a line of people in the hallway who have been told they can't come in yet. Jag, Sid, and a whole lot of brass. You've had a busy night, candidate." "I was just moving debris," Thorne said, her voice sounding like it had been dragged over gravel. The nurse paused, her hand on the pump. She looked at Thorne then, a brief, flickering moment of recognition. "My husband is a crew chief with the 160th. He was on the second bird. He said he's never seen a civilian or a candidate do what you did with that winch. He said you shouldn't be breathing." "The vectors were in my favor," Thorne replied. The nurse sighed, the sound of someone who had seen too many soldiers try to logic their way out of trauma. She finished the vitals, noted the elevated heart rate Thorne couldn't quite mask, and left without another word. Thorne went back to watching the clock. The 3-second delay was now a 4-second delay. The system was losing time. 3 miles away, in a wood-paneled office at the OCS battalion headquarters, Captain Holloway was discovering what it felt like to be the friction in the engine. He sat behind his desk, his uniform still damp at the hems, staring at a weather map that had been printed 4 hours too late to matter. On the desk sat his career, represented by a single manila folder containing the initial 15-6 investigation briefing. He hadn't smoked in 5 years, but his hands were shaking with a phantom craving that made his knuckles white. There was a knock on his door, sharp, rhythmic, and devoid of warmth. Before he could answer, Major Elias Thorne, no relation, a fact Holloway had checked 3 times in the last hour, stepped inside. Elias was the battalion executive officer, a man whose skin seemed made of tanned leather and whose eyes held the weary cynicism of a man who had spent 3 tours in the sandbox watching good plans fall apart. "The general wants the preliminary by 0900, Holloway," Elias said, not sitting down. He stood by the window, looking out at the parade ground where the morning mist was clinging to the grass like a shroud. "And CID is asking why the evacuation order was delayed by 45 minutes after the first flash flood warning hit the wire." "I made a command decision based on the data I had," Holloway said, his voice sounding thin even to his own ears. "The radar was showing a split in the cell. I thought we could beat the surge to the high ground." "You didn't think," Elias said, turning around. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the weight of a falling blade. "You gambled. You gambled with 30 candidates and a $10 million airframe because you didn't want to admit a candidate was right and you were wrong. And now I have a candidate in the ICU with 3 broken ribs and a shoulder that might never hold a ruck again, and a Black Hawk pilot who's going to be walking with a limp for the rest of his life. Do you have any idea how bad this looks?" Thorne was insubordinate. Holloway snapped, the last vestige of his ego flaring up. "She broke formation. She spoke out of turn. She challenged my authority in front of the entire company." "She saved the entire company," Elias countered. "I've spent the last hour interviewing the candidates who were on that ridge. Do you know what they're calling her? They're calling her the anchor. They said while you were staring at your radio trying to find a frequency that wasn't static, she was already calculating the height of the surge. They said she moved like she knew exactly where the water was going to go before the water knew it. Holloway looked down at his hands. What happens now? Now the institution does what it always does, Elias said. It protects the image. We can't have a story about a captain who ignored a genius candidate and almost killed everyone. That makes the OCS selection process look like a joke. But we also can't ignore what she did. So we're going to find a middle ground, a way to make her a hero without making you a villain. But if she doesn't play ball, Holloway, if she tells the truth about that 45-minute delay, then you're the one who gets sacrificed to the gods of the JAG Corps. Holloway felt a cold stone settle in his stomach. He realized then that he wasn't being protected because he was valued. He was being protected because his failure was an embarrassment to the brand. He was a faulty part in a machine that didn't like to admit it used cheap steel. Back at the hospital, the door to Thorne's room opened again at 07:30. It wasn't the doctor. It was Jackson. He looked terrible. His face was scratched from the briars, his eyes were bloodshot, and he was still wearing the same muddy boots he'd had on when they dragged Thorne out of the slurry. He walked to the side of her bed and stopped, his hands hovering as if he wanted to touch her but was afraid he'd break whatever was left. "They wouldn't let us in," he whispered. "The whole company is downstairs in the lobby. We told them we weren't leaving until we saw you." "You should be at the barracks," Thorne said, her eyes fixed on his. "You have a land nav practical at 10 o'clock. Jackson let out a short, jagged laugh that sounded more like a sob. "Land nav? Thorne, nobody gives a damn about land nav. Half the ridge is underwater. The instructors are all in meetings. The world stopped last night, and you're the only reason we're still in it." He sat in the hard plastic chair by the bed, his shoulders slumped. "I saw you go under Evelyn. I saw that wall of wood hit the raft, and I thought I just watched the best person I've ever known get erased because I was too quiet to back her up when she warned Holloway." "It wouldn't have changed his mind, Jackson," she said. "He's a linear thinker. The storm was non-linear. You can't argue with a man who only sees one dimension." "He's trying to blame you," Jackson said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss. "I heard the tactical officers talking in the hall. They are saying you recklessly endangered yourself. They're trying to frame it as a lucky break from a rogue candidate rather than a failure of his command. They're asking us, the candidates, to sign statements saying we felt unsafe because of your actions." Thorne felt a sharp, familiar coldness spread through her chest. It wasn't the cold of the water, it was the cold of the dark competence, the part of her that saw the institutional structure for what it was. A cage. "Did anyone sign?" she asked. "Not a single one," Jackson said, his eyes burning with a fierce, quiet loyalty. "Miller told the captain to go to hell, even the guys who hated you, the ones who thought you were too weird or too quiet. They're standing firm. We saw what you did with that winch, Thorne. We saw you dive into a debris flow with one arm. If they try to wash you out, we're all walking." "Don't do that," Thorne said, her voice sharp. "The Army needs people like you, people who can stay on the ridge when things go wrong." "The Army needs you," Jackson countered. "But I don't think they deserve you." He reached out then, his hand finally finding hers. Her fingers were bandaged, but he gripped them gently, his thumb tracing the line of her knuckles. It was a moment of profound, earned intimacy, a bridge built across the trauma of the night. Thorne didn't pull away. She let him hold her hand, the warmth of another human being providing the only real comfort she'd felt since the sky had turned black. "My shoulder is done, Jackson," she said quietly, the truth finally surfacing. "The doctor hasn't said it yet, but I know the mechanics of a joint. I felt the labrum tear when I hauled the pilot back. I felt the bone grind. I might graduate, but I'll never be 11 Alpha. I'll never lead a platoon in the field. They'll put me in a basement somewhere with a stack of technical manuals and thank me for my service." "Then we'll find a better basement," Jackson said. The door opened again, and this time the air in the room changed instantly. The weight of authority preceded the person entering. It was a man in a crisp Army combat uniform, the silver oak leaves of a lieutenant colonel on his chest. Beside him was a woman in a suit, JAG. "Candidate Jackson," the colonel said, his voice a polished baritone. "You are dismissed. Return to your unit immediately." Jackson hesitated, his grip on Thorne's hand tightening for a fraction of a second before he stood up. He looked at Thorne, a silent promise in his eyes, and then he squared his shoulders and walked past the officers. He didn't salute the colonel. He didn't even look at him. The woman in the suit closed the door and sat where Jackson had been. The colonel stood at the foot of the bed, his face a mask of professional concern that didn't reach his eyes. "Candidate Thorne," he began. I'm Colonel Vance, the battalion commander. This is Major Sterling from the Judge Advocate General's office. We're here to conduct a preliminary fact-finding interview regarding the events at Taylor Lake. The clock is 4 seconds slow, Colonel, Thorne said. Vance blinked, thrown off his rhythm. I beg your pardon? The clock on your wall, it's losing time. If this ward is synced to the main hospital server, then the entire diagnostic wing is operating on a faulty time stamp. It's a minor friction, but it's there. Sterling, the JAG officer, leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Candidate Thorne, we understand you've been through a significant trauma. We're not here to talk about the hospital's maintenance schedule. We're here to talk about why you disobeyed a direct order from Captain Holloway to remain with your squad. I didn't disobey an order, Thorne said, her voice calm and clinical. I fulfilled the secondary objective of the mission, which is the preservation of life and equipment when the primary objective has been rendered impossible by environmental factors. Captain Holloway's order was based on the assumption that the ridge was safe. My data indicated the ridge was about to be hit by a secondary surge. To stay was to die, to move was to survive. I chose survival. Your data? Sterling asked, scribbling on a legal pad. You mean your intuition? I mean the fact that the barometric pressure had dropped 6 millibars in 20 minutes. The sound of the creek had shifted 2 octaves higher due to increased sediment density, and the vibration in the ground indicated a structural failure of the upstream dam, Thorne said. It wasn't intuition, Major. It was physics. If you'd like, I can draft the fluid dynamics equations for the surge for you, though I'll need a pen and my right hand is currently hooked to Enrollment 4. The room went silent. Vance looked at Sterling, and for the first time, Thorne saw a crack in the colonel's composure. He wasn't dealing with a traumatized girl. He was dealing with a weapon he didn't know how to aim. We have statements from the other candidates, Vance said, his voice losing some of its polish. They say you predicted the flood. They say you warned the captain. Is that true? Yes. And the captain's response? Thorne looked at the slow clock. He told me to shut up and get in line. He told me that he was the one with the bars, and I was the one with the mud on my face. Those weren't his exact words, but that was the vector of the command. Sterling cleared her throat. Candidate, it's very important that you understand the gravity of what you're saying. If you claim a commissioned officer ignored a direct warning of a life-threatening disaster, you are initiating a process that will end in a court-martial. For him, certainly, but potentially for you if your data is found to be subjective. It's not subjective, Thorne said. Ask the pilot, ask the medic I pulled out of the bird, ask the 30 people who are still alive because I told them to climb the oak trees instead of staying in the hooches. The Army is a system of rules, Thorne, Vance said, stepping closer. And the most important rule is the chain of command. If every candidate decided they knew better than their captain because they felt a vibration in the ground, the entire structure would collapse. The structure almost collapsed last night, Colonel, Thorne said, her eyes locking onto his with a terrifying intensity. Not because of a vibration, but because the person at the top of the chain of command was more afraid of being wrong than he was of being dead. I'm a mechanic. I know what happens when you put too much pressure on a weak link. Holloway is a weak link. You can try to weld him back together with a few official statements, but the next time the pressure hits, he'll snap again. And next time, I won't be there to catch the pieces. Vance straightened his back, his face flushing a deep, angry red. You are still a candidate, Thorne. Do not forget your place. I haven't forgotten a thing, she said. They left 10 minutes later, their faces grim. As the door clicked shut, Thorne felt the full weight of the cost settling into her bones. She had just declared war on the institution she had spent her entire life trying to join. She had told the truth in a world where the story was more important, and she knew that the machine would now begin the slow, methodical process of grinding her down. By mid-afternoon, the personal cost arrived in a more physical form. The lead orthopedic surgeon, a colonel named Miller with hands that smelled of tobacco and lime, came in to review her MRI. He didn't sit down. He stood by the light box, looking at the grainy black and white images of Thorne's shoulder. You have a circumferential tear of the glenoid labrum, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. The humeral head was driven so far out of the socket that it chipped the bone on the way back in. We can operate, and we can get you back about 80% of your range of motion. But you'll never be able to lift more than 40 pounds over your head again. You'll never pass a standard combat fitness test at the elite level. He looked at her then, his eyes softened by a touch of genuine pity. I've read your file, Thorne. You wanted infantry. You wanted ranger school. That's over. The best I can offer you is a permanent profile and a reassignment to a support role. Logistics, maybe, or maintenance. Thorne felt a sharp, jagged piece of her identity break off and drift away. She had spent years under the hoods of trucks in Ohio, saving every cent, running miles in the rain with a pack full of bricks, all to prove that she was more than the role the world had assigned her. She had wanted to be at the tip of the spear. Now she was being told she was a broken tool, destined for the scrap heap of the administrative corps. "Can I still graduate OCS?" she asked. "Technically, yes," Miller said, "but the board has to approve a medical waiver, and given the political climate surrounding your case, I wouldn't hold my breath. The Army doesn't like to give waivers to people who make the news for the wrong reasons." "I made the news for the right reasons," she said. "In the Army, Thorne, they're often the same thing," the doctor replied. He left her then, and for the first time since the water had hit her, Thorne felt the thorn silence begin to crack. She looked at her right hand, the one that had held the cable, the one that had defied the current. It was shaking, not from cold, but from a quiet, controlled rage that felt like it could melt the hospital bed. She had done everything right. She had been the perfect soldier, the perfect calculator, the perfect savior. And the reward for her perfection was a broken body and a career in a basement. As the sun began to set, casting long, orange shadows across the ward, the door opened one more time. It was Captain Holloway. He wasn't wearing his hat. His hair was a mess, and his eyes were sunken and shadowed. He looked like a man who had spent the last 12 hours walking through a ghost town. He didn't come all the way into the room. He stayed by the door, his hand resting on the frame as if he needed it to stay upright. "I came to say," he started, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I came to say thank you for Vance and for the pilot." Thorne didn't say anything. She just watched him, her pale eyes unflinching. "They're going to relieve me of command," Holloway said, his voice a hollow whisper. "The general," she didn't even wait for the full report. She saw the sensor logs from the bird. She saw that I had 40 minutes of warning and I didn't move. She called me a catastrophic failure of leadership in front of the entire staff. He looked at Thorne, and for a second she saw the man behind the bars, a man who was small and scared, and realized he had been playing a game he didn't understand. "You were right," he said. "The whole time I couldn't understand how a candidate could know. I thought you were just being difficult. I thought you were trying to make me look bad." "I wasn't thinking about you at all, Captain," Thorne said. "I was thinking about the water." Holloway nodded slowly. "That's the difference, isn't it? I was worried about my career. You were worried about the mission. I lost mine. You lost yours too, didn't you? I heard about your shoulder." "The mission didn't fail," Thorne said. "That's all that matters." "Is it?" Holloway asked. "You're 24 years old, Thorne. You saved 30 lives and you've been discarded by the system before you even got your commission. Was it worth it?" Thorne looked at the clock. It was now 6 seconds slow. The drift was accelerating. "If I had stayed on that ridge, 30 people would be dead," she said. "The math is simple, Captain. My life, my career, my body. They're just variables. The result is the only thing that's real, so yes, it was worth it." Holloway looked at her for a long time, a mixture of awe and absolute shame on his face. He realized then that he was looking at something he would never be, a true soldier, someone who understood that the uniform was just clothes, but the duty was absolute. He straightened his back, gave her a slow, shaking salute, and walked out of the room. He was a man who would spend the rest of his life wondering if he would have had the courage to do what she did. Night fell over Fort Moore, but the hospital was never truly dark. The hum of the machinery, the distant calls of the staff, and the flickering lights of the helipad kept the world in a state of perpetual, artificial wakefulness. Thorne lay in the dark, her mind working through the next set of vectors. She knew what was coming next. The formal board. The attempt to buy her silence with a medical discharge and a small pension. The effort to bury the Thorne incident under a mountain of redacted paperwork. But she also knew something they didn't. She knew that the candidates were still in the lobby. She knew that Jackson was sitting on a bench outside, his head in his hands, waiting for her. She knew that the system was made of people and people were starting to see the cracks. The door opened one last time very late when the hospital was at its quietest. It was the general, Sarah Vance. She wasn't in her Class A's this time. She was in her PT gear, looking like she'd just come from a 5-mile run. She sat on the edge of Thorne's bed, her face unreadable in the shadows. "The 15-6 is a mess, Thorne," the general said. Holloway is gone. He'll be lucky if he doesn't end up in Leavenworth for criminal negligence. But the institution is scared of you. They're scared of what you represent. And what do I represent, ma'am? The fact that the system can be bypassed by someone with enough competence and enough courage, the general said. They like the idea of heroes, Thorne. They don't like the reality of them. Heroes are unpredictable. They make the bureaucrats feel unnecessary. She leaned in, her eyes sharp as flint. They're going to offer you a deal tomorrow, a full medical retirement. They'll call it an honorable discharge for injuries sustained in the line of duty. They'll give you a medal and a check, and they'll ask you to go back to Ohio and never talk to a reporter. And if I refuse, then they'll fight you, the general said. They'll challenge your medical waiver. They'll bring up every minor infraction from your time in OCS. They'll try to prove that you're mentally unstable due to the trauma. They'll make your life a living hell for the next 2 years while you wait for a commission that might never come. Thorne felt the dark competence flare up, a cold, bright flame in the center of her chest. She looked at the general, and for the first time she smiled, a small, sharp movement of her lips that held no warmth. They think they can outlast me, Thorne said. They're used to winning, the general replied. They've never played against physics, ma'am, Thorne said. The more pressure they apply, the more the structure will fail. I don't need a medal. And I don't need their money, I just need a commission. The general stood up, her face softening into something that looked suspiciously like pride. I suspected you'd say that. I've already contacted a few people in Washington, people who don't like it when the Army tries to bury its best and brightest. We're going to make sure that board is public, Thorne. We're going to make sure every candidate in this battalion is sitting in the gallery. Why are you helping me, ma'am? Thorne asked. The general walked to the door and paused. Because 20 years ago, I was a candidate who was told I didn't belong because I was a woman. I spent my whole career fighting the drift, and I'm tired of watching the drift win. She left, and the silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of the moments before a battle, the silence of a fuse burning down. Thorne looked at the clock. It was 7 seconds slow now. She reached out with her right hand and picked up the small plastic water cup on her bedside table. Her shoulder screamed, a white-hot flare of agony that made her vision swim, but she didn't stop. She forced her arm up, inch by inch, fighting the gravity and the ruin of her own body. She brought the cup to her lips, took a sip of the lukewarm water, and set it back down without making a sound. The pain was a variable. The limitation was a constraint, but the mission, her mission, was still active. She closed her eyes and began to map out the next phase. She saw the board members. She saw the questions. She saw the pressure points. She would meet them with the same clinical detachment she had used to navigate the flood. She would be the friction that the machine couldn't ignore. The reckoning was coming, not just for Holloway, and not just for the battalion, but for the entire institution that had forgotten that the strength of the Army wasn't in its protocols, but in the people who knew when to break them. Outside, the rain began to fall again. A soft, steady drizzle that washed the last of the red clay from the windows of Martin Army Community Hospital. Thorne listened to the sound, a rhythmic, predictable pattern, and for the first time in her life she wasn't afraid of the water. She was the anchor, and the anchor wasn't moving. She waited for the sun to rise on the final day of the candidate she used to be and the first day of the soldier she was becoming. The cost was high. The path was broken. But as the clock clicked over to 0600, Thorne felt a strange, quiet peace. The system was broken, but she knew exactly how to fix it. She adjusted her sling, felt the steady thrum of her own heart, and waited for the door to open. She was ready for the board. She was ready for the fight, and she was ready for the truth, no matter what it cost. The silence was no longer a shield. It was a weapon. And as the first light of dawn touched the wall, Evelyn Thorne prepared to use it. The discharge paperwork felt heavier than the medical file, a stack of white bond paper that smelled of toner and finality. Evelyn Thorne sat on the edge of the hospital bed, her right hand, the one that worked, tracing the embossed seal of the Department of the Army. It was 0900 on a Monday morning, exactly 72 hours after the general had left her room, and the air in the ward was thick with the scent of floor wax and the low-frequency hum of a floor buffer in the hallway. Her left arm was still locked in the black tactical sling, a rigid cage that felt less like medical equipment and more like a permanent part of her geography. The 3-second drift on the wall clock had been corrected over the weekend, a small, silent victory that Thorne noted with a tightening of her jaw. The system was back on time, but she was still moving through the aftermath at a different speed. A captain from the personnel office, a man whose name she didn't bother to memorize, stood by the window. He was looking at his watch, the universal gesture of a man who had somewhere more important to be. He had already laid out the administrative separation packet, a neatly tabbed folder that offered Thorne a graceful exit, a 30% disability rating, a medical discharge under honorable conditions, and a severance check that would pay for a very comfortable life back in Ohio. It was the drift in paper form, the institutional way of making a problem go away by making it comfortable. "You have 48 hours to review the terms, candidate," the captain said, his voice flat. "But given the MRI results and the 15-6 preliminary, the command feels this is the most beneficial path for all parties. You're a hero, Thorne. Nobody's disputing that. But a hero with a torn labrum and a permanent profile can't lead a platoon. Take the win, go home." Thorne didn't look at him. She was looking at a small, jagged scar on her right thumb, a souvenir from a 1994 Ford F-150 transmission she'd rebuilt when she was 19. "I'm not a party, Captain," she said quietly. "I'm a soldier, and I haven't finished my training." The captain sighed, a sound of professional exasperation. "The OCS board reconvenes at 13:00 today. If you don't sign these papers, you'll be standing in front of them with no protection. They'll look at your physical limitations, they'll look at the insubordination charge Holloway's defense is trying to stick on you, and they'll wash you out with nothing. No disability, no pension, just a ticket back to Columbus." "Then I'll be on time for the 13:00, Thorne said. She stood up, the movement sending a sharp, electric jolt through her ribs. She didn't flinch. She had learned over the last 4 days how to breathe into the pain, how to treat it like a technical constraint in an engine, something to be managed, not something to be feared. The captain shook his head and left the room, leaving the folder on the bed. Thorne left it there. She walked to the small locker where her belongings had been stored. Her OCS uniform was there, cleaned and pressed by someone, likely Jackson, but the left sleeve of the jacket had been carefully slit and fitted with Velcro to accommodate the sling. It was a modification of necessity, a visual marker of her status as a broken thing. She dressed slowly, her right hand doing the work of two. The act of buttoning her shirt was a tactical exercise in leverage and patience. Every movement cost her a measured amount of breath. By the time she had the jacket on and the sling secured, she was sweating, a thin sheen of cold moisture on her forehead, but her reflection in the small, scratched mirror of the locker showed nothing but the Thorne silence. Her eyes were clear, pale, and focused on the middle distance. She looked like a woman who had already seen the end of the day and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. The walk from the hospital to the battalion headquarters was less than a mile, but under the Georgia sun, with the humidity sitting at 80%, it felt like a forced march. The air smelled of damp pine and asphalt. As she crossed the main parade ground, she saw a company of candidates in their PT gear, the rhythmic chant of their cadence drifting across the grass. They were running in a tight, disciplined block, their boots hitting the ground in a single, thunderous heartthrob. Thorne stopped for a moment, her gaze tracking them. She saw the dust kicked up by their heels, the way the sunlight caught the sweat on their backs. She was no longer part of that rhythm. She was a ghost in a dress uniform, walking against the current. As she approached the headquarters building, she saw him. Jackson was leaning against the brick pillar of the entrance, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked different than he had in the hospital. The exhaustion had been replaced by a hard, brittle alertness. He was in his Class B uniform, his brass polished to a mirror finish. When he saw her, he straightened up, his eyes scanning her from head to toe, lingering on the sling. "You look like hell, Thorne," he said, but his voice was thick with a fierce, quiet pride. "The drag coefficient of the sling is higher than I anticipated," she replied. "They're all inside," Jackson said, nodding toward the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. "The board of 5. Colonel Vance is presiding. Holloway's JAG lawyer is in there too, looking like he's ready to chew through a lead pipe. They've been calling in candidates all morning, trying to get someone to say you panicked. Trying to say the winch was an accident, not a calculation." "Did they?" Jackson's smile was a quick, dangerous flash of teeth. "Miller told them that if you hadn't dived for that cable, he'd be a memory. Then he told the colonel that if they tried to punish you for saving his life, he'd make sure the story hit the front page of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution before the sun went down. They didn't like that. They dismissed him pretty quick." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "There's a crowd forming, Evelyn. Word got out that you weren't signing the separation papers. The tactical officers are trying to keep the hallways clear, but the candidates are just staying. They're lining the corridor from the front door to the boardroom. They're not saying a word. They're just standing there." Thorne felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth in her chest, a flicker of something that wasn't logic and wasn't data. It was loyalty, the specific, unearned weight of people who had decided she was worth standing for. She looked at the heavy doors. "They're waiting for a show, Jackson," she said. "I'm just going to give them the math." She walked past him, her boots clicking on the linoleum floor of the hallway. Jackson was right. The corridor was lined with men and women in uniform, 30 of them standing at a loose version of attention. They were the ones from the ridge, the ones who had climbed the oak trees, the ones who had watched her disappear under a wall of slurry and timber. As she passed, not a single one spoke, but the air in the hallway seemed to vibrate with their presence. It was a corridor of witnesses, a human barrier against the drift. At the end of the hall, a sergeant first class stood guard at the door. He looked at Thorne, then at the sling, and for a second his professional mask slipped. He gave her a sharp, crisp nod and opened the door. The boardroom was cool, the air conditioning struggling against the Georgia heat. A long, mahogany table dominated the space, occupied by 5 officers whose faces were a study in institutional gravity. Colonel Vance sat in the center, his silver oak leaves catching the light from the overhead fluorescence. To his left was Major Sterling, the JAG officer from the hospital, and to his right, a lieutenant colonel from the medical corps. Thorne walked to the center of the room, stopped at the designated mark, and saluted with her right hand. The movement was stiff, her ribs protesting with a dull, grinding ache, but she held it until Vance returned the gesture. "Take a seat, Candidate Thorne," Vance said. His voice was no longer angry. It was tired, the sound of a man who had spent the last 48 hours trying to manage a PR disaster that was growing legs. Thorne sat in the hard wooden chair, her sling resting against the edge of the table. She didn't lean back. She sat perfectly vertical, her spine a straight line of iron and bone. "We have reviewed your medical file," Vance began, tapping a pen against the table. "And we have reviewed the statements from the 15-6 investigation. The board acknowledges your actions at Taylor Lake were exceptional. The saving of a multi-million-dollar airframe and the lives of 4 crew members and 30 candidates is a feat of significant merit. We are prepared to recommend you for the Soldier's Medal." He paused, waiting for a reaction. Thorne gave him none. She watched the way the dust motes danced in the light above his head. "However," Vance continued, his voice hardening, "this board is tasked with determining your suitability for a commission. The United States Army requires its officers to be physically capable of leading from the front. According to Colonel Miller's report, your left shoulder is permanently compromised. You cannot clear a standard obstacle course. You cannot ruck 40 miles with a 60-pound pack. You cannot lead an infantry platoon into combat." "I am aware of the physical constraints, Colonel," Thorne said. "Then you understand why we cannot grant you a commission in the combat arms," Major Sterling added, leaning forward. "Given the nature of your injury, even a support role would require a significant medical waiver, a waiver that the Department of the Army is unlikely to grant for a candidate who hasn't even completed the course." The 15-6 report also notes a breakdown in the chain of command, the lieutenant colonel from the medical corps said. "Captain Holloway's defense team is arguing that your actions, while successful, were a violation of AR 600-20. They are claiming that by leaving your assigned position, you created a secondary hazard that could have resulted in more casualties. They're calling it outcome bias. They say you got lucky." Thorne looked at the lieutenant colonel. "Luck is a word people use to describe variables they failed to account for. I accounted for the surge. I accounted for the structural failure of the dam. I accounted for the tension limits of the winch cable. There was no luck involved. There was only a choice between certain death and a calculated risk. I chose the risk." "And what about the next time?" Vance asked. "What happens when you're in a situation where you can't calculate the physics? What happens when your physical limitations prevent you from acting on your data?" "I'm a mechanic, Colonel," Thorne said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "When a part of an engine fails, you don't throw the whole truck away. You recalibrate the system. You find a way to use the remaining torque to achieve the mission. My left arm is a failed part. My mind is the engine. The Army spends millions of dollars training people to follow orders. It spends almost nothing training them to see the truth when the orders are wrong. I can see the truth. I saw the water before it arrived. I saw the failure of the dam before the sensors did. You're telling me the army has no use for that because I can't climb a rope." The room went silent. Vance looked at the other board members. Sterling was scribbling on her pad, her face unreadable. The medical officer was looking at Thorne's sling with a mixture of pity and professional curiosity. "We have a compromise to offer," Vance said finally. "We will allow you to graduate with your class. You will receive your commission as a second lieutenant, but it will be a medical commission into the administrative corps. You'll be assigned to a desk in Maryland, processing personnel files. You'll have your rank, you'll have your pension, and the Army will have its hero without the liability of a broken officer in the field." Thorne felt the dark competence rise in her, a cold, sharp blade of clarity. They were still trying to hide her. They were offering her a golden cage, a way to keep her quiet and out of sight, a variable that had been solved and filed away. "I didn't come here to process files, Colonel," Thorne said. "And I didn't come here to be a hero. I came here to serve the mission. If the mission is the preservation of the force through the application of technical expertise, then put me where the technical expertise matters. Put me in military intelligence. Put me in the Signal Corps. Put me in the 75th Innovation Command. But don't put me in a basement." Vance leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "You're negotiating, candidate. That's a bold move for someone whose career is currently on life support." "I'm not negotiating," Thorne said. "I'm telling you how to use the tool you have. If you put me in an administrative role, I will be a suboptimal asset. If you put me where I can see the data, I will save more lives than I did at Taylor Lake. That's the math. You can choose to ignore it, just like Captain Holloway did, but the results will be the same." Vance's face flushed a deep, angry red. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the door to the boardroom opened. It wasn't the sergeant at the door. It was General Sarah Vance. She didn't say a word. She walked to the back of the room and stood by the wall, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the board. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The drift evaporated, replaced by the high-voltage tension of a superior officer watching her subordinates. Colonel Vance cleared his throat, his posture stiffening. "General, we were just finishing the deliberation." "Carry on, Colonel," the general said. "I'm just an observer. I'm interested to see how this battalion defines leadership in the face of extraordinary competence." The board members looked at each other, the silence stretching until it became a physical weight. Thorne didn't look back at the general. She kept her eyes on the colonel, her expression as flat and unyielding as a sheet of steel. Vance looked at the papers in front of him, then at the general, then back at Thorne. He seemed to be weighing the cost of his own career against the cost of the decision. Finally, he picked up a pen and signed the bottom of a document. "The board will recommend a medical waiver for your commission," Vance said, his voice sounding like it was being squeezed out of him. "But not for combat arms, and not for admin. We will recommend you for a branch-detailed assignment to the Military Intelligence Corps with a secondary specialty in technical surveillance. You will complete your training here at Fort Moore, and then you will report to Fort Huachuca for the basic officer leadership course." He looked at her, and for a fleeting second, Thorne saw a flash of genuine respect in his eyes, a recognition of a predator he couldn't tame. "But understand this, Thorne, you are on a very short leash. If your physical profile prevents you from completing a single requirement of the course, the waiver is revoked. You will be the most watched second lieutenant in the United States Army. Do you understand?" "I understand, Colonel," Thorne said. "I've always preferred being watched. It ensures the data is recorded correctly." She stood up, saluted, this time with a precision that felt like a declaration of war, and walked out of the room. As the door closed behind her, the hallway erupted in a sound that Thorne had never heard before. It wasn't a cheer. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, 30 pairs of boots hitting the linoleum in a slow, deliberate cadence. The anchor had held. She walked through the corridor of soldiers, her head high, her left arm locked in its cage, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a mechanic. She felt like a soldier. The 3 months that followed were a blur of white-hot pain and clinical obsession, while the rest of her OCS class moved through the final phases of training, the tactical exercises, the leadership labs, the ceremonial marches. Thorne lived in a world of physical therapy and data. The Army's PT clinic at Fort Moore smelled of peppermint oil and recycled air. Thorne spent 4 hours every morning there, her teeth clenched against a rubber mouthguard as a therapist named Sarah, a woman with forearms like corded rope, worked to break down the scar tissue in her shoulder. The pain was non-linear. It didn't fade, it just changed shape. Sometimes it was a dull, throbbing ache that felt like her arm was being crushed by a hydraulic press. Other times it was a sharp, stabbing heat that made her vision go white. "You're pushing too hard, Thorne," Sarah would say, her hands digging into the ruined muscles. "The bone chip is stable, but the labrum is held together by prayers and 3 titanium anchors. If you pop one of those, you're done. Back to Ohio, do you hear me?" "I hear you," Thorne would rasp, her eyes fixed on a spot on the ceiling. "Increase the resistance. I'm at 40% range of motion. I need to be at 60 by Friday." She didn't just do the PT. She studied the anatomy of her own injury with the same intensity she'd used to study the Taylor Lake Dam. She mapped the nerve paths, the muscle insertions, the mechanical limits of the anchors. She learned how to bypass the pain by engaging her core, how to use the torque of her body to compensate for the weakness in the joint. She turned herself into a machine that was being rebuilt in real time, a prototype that was being tested to the point of failure every single day. Jackson visited her every evening. He would bring her food from the mess hall and sit on the floor of her small barracks room while she went through her homework, a series of grueling exercises with elastic bands and weighted balls. "Holloway's court-martial starts next week," Jackson said one evening, watching her struggle to lift a 5-pound weight over her head. "They're charging him with dereliction of duty and reckless endangerment." The pilot's testimony was the nail in the coffin. He told the investigators that the only reason they didn't crash into the trees was because you gave them the exact vector for the winch. Thorne stopped, her arm trembling. She lowered the weight and took a shaky breath. "He was a good pilot. He just didn't have the right data." "He says he wants to meet you," Jackson said. "After he's done with the board, he says he owes you a beer or a car, whichever you want." "I don't want a car," Thorne said, her eyes narrowing as she picked the weight back up. "I want to be able to salute at the graduation ceremony without my shoulder popping out of the socket." "You'll be there," Jackson said, his voice soft but certain. "I've seen you work, Evelyn. You don't let things stay broken." The graduation ceremony took place on a Friday in late August. The Georgia air was a thick, humid blanket that smelled of cut grass and diesel. The parade ground was a sea of green and gold. The families of the candidates gathered in the bleachers, their faces blurred by the heat haze. Thorne stood in the front rank of her platoon. Her uniform was perfect, the creases of her trousers sharp enough to cut paper, her brass shining like a warning. The sling was gone, replaced by a rigid brace hidden beneath her jacket. Her left arm hung at her side, seemingly natural, though the effort required to keep it there was costing her every ounce of her willpower. The band began to play "The Army Goes Rolling Along," the brassy, triumphant notes echoing off the brick buildings of the OCS campus. Thorne felt the vibration of the music in her teeth. She watched the colors as they were marched onto the field, the American flag snapping in the light breeze. One by one, the candidates were called forward to receive their commissions. Jackson went first, his face a mask of professional pride as he received his gold bars. When he walked back to the formation, he caught Thorne's eye for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had shared. Then the narrator's voice boomed over the speakers. "Candidate Evelyn Thorne." The parade ground went silent. It wasn't the silence of the Thorne silence. It was the silence of 1,000 people holding their breath. The story of the ghost of the Pine Barrens had become a legend at Fort Moore, a tale of a woman who had fought the water and won, and then fought the army and won again. Thorne walked forward. Every step was a calculation of balance and pain. She reached the center of the field where General Vance was waiting for her. The general looked at her, her eyes searching Thorne's face for a sign of weakness, of regret, of anything but the cold, steady competence that had brought her here. "Second Lieutenant Thorne," the general whispered, pinning the gold bars to her shoulders. "You did it. You stayed on the ridge." "The ridge was the only place to be, ma'am," Thorne replied. Then came the moment she had been dreading for 3 months. The salute. Thorne looked at the general. She felt the titanium anchors in her shoulder, the tension of the scar tissue, the mechanical limits of the joint. She took a breath, engaged her core, and brought her right hand up. It was a perfect, crisp salute, a movement that looked effortless to everyone in the bleachers, but felt like 1,000 needles being driven into her collarbone. She held it for 3 seconds, 1, 2, 3, before bringing it back down. The general saluted back, a slow, deliberate gesture of respect that lasted a second longer than protocol required. As Thorne walked back to her platoon, she didn't feel the heat or the pain or the weight of the gold bars. She felt a quiet, profound sense of arrival. She was no longer the girl from Ohio with the grease under her fingernails. She was no longer the candidate who didn't belong. She was a second lieutenant in the United States Army, a weapon that had been forged in the fire and the water and the silence. The celebration afterward was a chaotic blur of handshakes and photographs. Families crowded around the new officers, the air filled with laughter and the sound of popping corks. Thorne stayed on the edge of the crowd, her back against a brick wall, her right hand tucked into her pocket to hide the slight tremor that had started after the salute. Jackson found her there, 2 plastic cups of lukewarm sparkling cider in his hands. He handed her one and leaned against the wall beside her. "So," he said, looking out at the happy families. "What now, Lieutenant?" "Fort Huachuca on Monday," Thorne said, taking a sip of the cider. "I start the technical surveillance course, then a 6-month deployment to a joint task force in Virginia." "Military intelligence," Jackson said, shaking his head. "They have no idea what they're getting, do they? They think they're getting an analyst. They're getting a human supercomputer with a grudge against the laws of physics." "I don't have a grudge, Jackson," Thorne said, her eyes tracking a small bird as it darted through the trees. "I just don't like it when the math doesn't add up." He looked at her, his expression softening. "You're going to be a great officer, Evelyn, but don't forget to be a person every now and then. The Army is a system, but the people, we're the ones who have to live in it." "I haven't forgotten the people," Thorne said, her gaze returning to him. "I'm still holding the cable." He smiled, a genuine warm smile that made the lines around his eyes crinkle. He raised his cup. "To the anchor." "To the mission," she replied. They stood there in the fading light of the afternoon, 2 young officers at the beginning of a world they didn't yet understand, bound together by a night they would never be able to explain. 2 weeks later, Thorne was in Arizona. Fort Huachuca sat in the shadow of the Huachuca Mountains, a stark, beautiful landscape of high desert and jagged peaks. The air was dry and smelled of dust and sagebrush. It was a world of signals and satellites, of encrypted frequencies and silent watchers. Thorne's office was a small, windowless room in the basement of the intelligence center. It was filled with monitors, servers, and a stack of technical manuals that reached her waist. It was exactly the basement the doctor had warned her about, but to Thorne, it was a cockpit. She sat at her desk, her right hand moving across the keyboard with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. She was reviewing the sensor data from a forward operating base in a place she wasn't allowed to name. The data was a mess, a chaotic jumble of thermal readings, acoustic signatures, and seismic vibrations. The analysts in Washington had already dismissed it as environmental noise. Thorne didn't move. She watched the screen, her mind stripping away the noise, looking for the pattern. She saw the drift in the timing of the seismic spikes. She saw the shift in the thermal gradient of the perimeter wall. She saw the silence where there should have been sound. She reached for her phone and dialed a number she had memorized on her first day. "This is Second Lieutenant Thorne," she said, her voice calm and clinical. "I have a delta on the perimeter of Sector 4. The seismic readings indicate a structural compromise. It's not noise, it's a tunnel." There was a silence on the other end of the line. "Lieutenant, we've already cleared that sector. The ground is solid rock." "The ground was solid rock," Thorne said, her eyes fixed on the flickering screen. "But the barometric pressure has shifted 2 millibars in the last hour, and the vibration frequency has moved up 3 octaves. Someone is using a thermal drill. If you don't move the personnel in the next 20 minutes, the floor of the barracks is going to collapse." "Wait, how do you know the barometric pressure? We don't even have a sensor for that in Sector 4. "I'm looking at the cooling rate of the server racks in the basement," Thorne said. "The air density is changing. The math doesn't lie. Move the men." She hung up the phone and waited. She didn't pace. She didn't pray. She just watched the clock on the wall, the one she had calibrated herself to ensure there was no drift. 19 minutes later, the screen erupted in a flare of red. A massive seismic spike followed by a sudden drop in the thermal signature. The floor had collapsed. 5 minutes after that, her phone rang. It was a colonel she had never met, his voice shaking with a mixture of shock and terror. "They are out, Thorne, every single one of them. We got the last man out 30 seconds before the floor went. How the hell did you see that?" Thorne looked at her left arm, the one that still ached in the cold, the one that would never be able to clear an obstacle course. She felt the Thorne silence settle over her, a quiet, profound peace that had nothing to do with medals or rank. "The variables were in our favor, Colonel," she said. She hung up and went back to work. She had 3 more sectors to analyze, and the night was just beginning. A year later, Evelyn Thorne stood on a small, windswept hill in Ohio. It was a cold, gray day in November, the kind of day that made the bones ache. She was wearing a civilian coat, her hands tucked into her pockets. Beside her stood a man in a pilot's uniform, the man she had pulled out of the Black Hawk at Taylor Lake. They were standing in front of a small granite memorial dedicated to the victims of the Great Flood of 1994. Thorne had never been here before. She had spent her whole life trying to escape the memory of the water, only to find herself defined by it. "I still can't believe you did it," the pilot said, his voice a low whisper in the wind. "I still dream about it sometimes, the sound of that cable snapping, the feeling of your hand on my flight suit. I didn't even know you were a woman until they put me on the stretcher." "It didn't matter," Thorne said. "I know," he replied, "but I wanted you to have this." He reached into his pocket and handed her a small, tarnished object. It was a wrench, a 10mm Craftsman, the kind you'd find in any mechanic's toolbox. It was old, the chrome peeling at the edges, but it felt heavy and real in her hand. "It was my father's," the pilot said. "He was a mechanic, too. He told me that a tool is only as good as the person holding it. I think he would have liked you." Thorne looked at the wrench. She saw her reflection in the metal, a woman who was older, harder, and more certain of herself than she had been a year ago. She saw the scar on her thumb. She saw the strength in her right hand. "Thank you," she said. She stayed on the hill for a long time after the pilot had left. She watched the way the wind moved through the dead grass, the way the clouds shifted across the gray sky. She thought about the mission. She thought about the cost. She thought about the path that had led her from a garage in Columbus to a basement in Arizona. She realized then that the drift would always be there. The systems would always fail. The leaders would always be human. But she also realized that she was no longer afraid of the failure. She was the one who could see the cracks. She was the one who could hold the cable. She reached out with her left hand, the one that had been broken, the one that was held together by titanium and sheer will. She gripped the wrench. It was a slow, painful movement, her shoulders screaming at the exertion, but she didn't stop until her fingers were closed around the metal. She held it tight, her knuckles white, her breath steady and even. The Thorne silence was gone, replaced by the low, constant thrum of the world, the sound of the wind, the vibration of the earth, the rhythmic ticking of the clock. She was a part of it now, a variable that couldn't be ignored, an anchor that wouldn't be moved. She turned and walked down the hill toward her car. Every step was a calculation, every breath was a choice. She reached the car, a 2012 Chevy Silverado that she had rebuilt herself, and sat in the driver's seat. She put the wrench in the glove box right next to her commission papers. She started the engine, listening to the perfect, rhythmic hum of the cylinders. She checked the oil pressure. She checked the temperature. She checked the timing. Everything was in alignment. She pulled out onto the highway, the gray landscape of Ohio blurring past her window. She was heading back to the base, back to the monitors, back to the silent war that only she knew how to fight. The path ahead was long, and the cost would always be high, but as she merged into the flow of the traffic, Evelyn Thorne felt a strange, quiet peace. The world was breaking, but she knew exactly how to fix it. She drove into the gathering dark, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her right hand steady on the wheel. She was no longer looking for a way out. She was looking for the next ridge. The 3-second drift was gone, and the anchor was holding. She reached the outskirts of town and saw a sign for a diner, a small, neon-lit place that smelled of coffee and wood smoke. She pulled over and sat at the counter, a lone woman in a quiet room. She ordered a cup of black coffee and sat in the silence, her eyes tracking the movement of the second hand on the wall clock. It was perfect. She took a sip of the coffee, felt the warmth spread through her chest, and looked out the window at the rain. It was falling softly now, a gentle, rhythmic patter against the glass. It was just water. She closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her, a mechanical melody that she finally understood. She was the mechanic, she was the soldier, she was the anchor, and the math was finally right.